Okay. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming. I'm Sandy, and we decided to have this meeting after the 14th of March, when we had something that went viral, which I had no idea was going to, and it's had a lot of traction. So there was something that we needed to do, and it was to follow it up. And I really want to thank the members of the council for being here, for turning up, John and Ian and Lokabandu and all of the council, the council members that are here. I don't know whether Indra's here. Is Indra the mayor here yet? Oh, Indra's here. Okay, thank you. Brilliant. Well, because, initially it's taken 4 months to get this off the ground. Because of all sorts of reasons, that we changed mayors and all sorts of things. But initially we wanted it to be a debate, and we did ask members of the council to get involved and speak and everything. But we had very little response from you, and I don't know why. It's now more of a Q&A, but I'd be very, very... I know Indra is going to do her address, and then she has an engagement at a school. But it would be so lovely to have the other members of the council. I don't know if the town clerk's here. Is the town clerk here? No. Connor? No, Connor's not here. It would be really nice to have, some sort of conversation about net zero, about climate emergencies, and really have a proper debate, because that's what we really wanted, and that's what hopefully we will achieve tonight. And get some dialogue going. We need to have dialogue on this. We've got all these meetings about 5G happening all over the country. When have we ever had a meeting about net zero? And net zero is the very thing that, if we're not careful, will destroy our economy and it destroy our way of lives. And I'm sorry to say that. I know the Green councils don't agree with this, but we have sufficient evidence to believe that there is, and for a long time, I've been on this. I've been on Agenda 21 and 2030 for the last 16 years. And I've been called a mad conspiracy theorist all that time. And people are now waking up. The very fact that 12 minutes in Glastonbury Town Council got 7 million views and counting. Thank you. Thank you very much. It means that this conversation is needed. It's needed desperately. And I really, really thank the council for coming to talk about this, because the truth will bubble up. You can't stop the truth. It unleash it, and it's like a lion, it defends itself. And so we just need to get this conversation going in every town council in this country, if we are to have a future for our children and our grandchildren. Thank you. Thank you. I know that we've got a lot, really. We've got climate emergencies going on in almost every town council. There's been very little scrutiny into the science behind these climate emergencies, and certainly not much recourse to the people that it affects. And this is what we need to redress. We need to redress the fact that people of the community aren't engaging, and it's our fault too. We have not engaged enough with the town councils. And we need to address that. We need to understand that we have not engaged enough. And there's people now beginning to engage in their town councils and really looking at the finances of town councils, how it's being spent, and whether the money being spent in some of these town councils actually is serving the people. And where, that we need scrutiny on everything. And hopefully, through these meetings, we will get more people engaging with their town councils to understand why these policies are being pushed through. And there's an acceleration process going on. I'm sure you're aware. And the 15-minute cities and the LTNs and the low traffic neighbourhoods, or whatever you want to call them, and the 20-minute cities, 10-minute cities, 5-minute cities, they're getting worse and worse. That has really woken a lot of people up. They've suddenly realised, hang on, what is going on here? And why do we need all this surveillance? Why do we need surveillance? Why do we need all these cameras? Why do we have the number plate recognition and fines? And what is going on here? Because the draconian measures are really what's happening in all over the world. And this is not a grassroots movement at all. This is a global agenda for a technocratic dictatorship. And we need to get on top of this and get our heads around this. This is really a dystopian future that they have for us, which we are not going to accept. We will not accept it. Okay? Thank you. Now, I think I've probably done 10 minutes of waffling on. So I just want to say thank you so much to our speakers. We have Ralph Ellis, who's a fantastic climate scientist. Bit of a polymath. Fantastic, information here about climate. And we have Peter Taylor, who has these fabulous books here. He published this a long, long time ago. He lost his work because of this. He was kicked out of the IPCC at the UN. Good for you, Peter. And bargain, £10 a copy. And we've got Ian Jarvis. Where's Ian? Ian's gone. Oh, there he is. Ian Jarvis talking about the, bless you, talking about the 5G and the EMFs and the AI that's coming in. And then I will do a talk a little bit later about my subject. It's going to be a very potted version of the history of Agenda 21 2030 and how it's playing out now and what we can do about it and how we can just literally, the only way to deal with this is through our communities. When this was dreamt up many, many years ago, I mean before the 1970s, and it was actually born at the Earth Summit in 1992. Agenda 21 was born at the Earth Summit in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. And it was brought from global to local. They put it into our town council so that ICLEI, the International Committee for Local and Environmental Initiatives, was brought in to every single town council in the world. And it's in every town council in the UK. So we need to unpick that because it's actually been given a lot of false information. And we need to unpick up from local to global now. This is our job. We need to challenge some of this. I mean, yeah, we all want a really sustainable, green planet. We need to have a clean, unpolluted planet. We all want that. But we don't need this form of control. And it's a bit like the Chinese social credit system. We do not need it, we do not want it, and we will not have it. Thank you. I think Eli, shall I introduce our first speaker is Ralph? Is it? Yeah. I'd like to introduce Mr. Ralph Ellis, Professor Ralph Ellis. Oh, Indra's speaking. Oh, you're there. I thought you were down there. Indra, thank you so much. I didn't see that you were there. Bless you. Thanks so much for speaking, and thank you for this address. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. And thank you. It's lovely to see so many people in this hall. It's lovely to see so many community and visitors who have come to Glastonbury. Thank you. Please excuse me reading from a paper. I don't usually like doing that, but I have 10 minutes and I've got to get a lot.
Thank you.
My reading paper. So, I'm grateful for this opportunity to inform our community about its council's work. I'm grateful for the subject matter. After so much speculation, after so much speculation, fear and division. So I will start with the report. I'm going to talk about three things. So first I'll do a report from our council about our plans and accomplishments, including a report from our Climate Emergency Resilient Officer, and you should have, there was a flyer, an A4 flyer, so there's lots of figures on it, so yeah, you can zone out at that point and then read it later. Then I will do a report about me as the Mayor of Glastonbury and my plans for this year. And lastly, I would like to address some of the issues, the topics this evening. So firstly, Glastonbury has the only Green majority council in the UK. We do not subscribe to anybody else's agenda. We're a council made up of informed, hard-working, non-paid residents, including scientists, researchers, academics, and activists. So this is a list. We banned glyphosates and all other chemicals on our verges and parks, and we worked with the National Trust to ban its use on our Tor, which is a sacred monument. Glastonbury Council adopted a 5G precautionary principle after months of meetings, the only one, I believe, so far in England. We're a frat-free town, we're a single-use plastic, Earth Protector town, and we're updating this town hall to pay for itself. We're the first council to actually do that. So we're saving money, not spending it. So over the past 2 years, Glastonbury Town Council has been working to meet its commitment to respond to the climate and ecological emergency. Oh, sorry, I'm now going into the report from our Climate and Ecological Resilience Officer. Bad typing. So over the past 2 years, Glastonbury Council has been working to meet its commitment to respond to the climate and ecological emergency and to make its operations carbon neutral by 2030. That's this hall and the places that we have, our estates, so not out there. Yeah, that's within our estate. So Glastonbury Town Council has cut our carbon footprint of our estate and town hall by 39%, and that's in 2 years. We've saved over £4,000, that's in its running costs. These actions have been had a significant effect already, reducing 100% of carbon emissions from electricity use by switching to ecotricity, which is an electrical supply that is 100% renewable, reducing 49% of vehicle emissions by replacing the old diesel van with a second-hand electric van. So by reducing 36% of the emissions from gas used to heat the town hall, by replacing the ancient gas boiler with a new one, and zoning some of the heating systems so that it works more efficiently. While cutting carbon by 39% is a good start, Glastonbury Town Council still has a lot of work to do to reach carbon neutral by 2030. In our role to serve the people of Glastonbury, everything we plan to do must also reduce waste, save money, protect the natural world, support community projects, and help everyone to prepare for the changes that will lie ahead. So, the town hall improvements. Retrofit plan, insulation, double glazing, ventilation and zoning the heating system, not rocket science. Appropriate technology, solar panels, EV chargers, energy management. Supporting nature, more trees, hedges and wildflower planting. Can't disagree with that one. Encouraging food growing, including allotment and peat restorations. Community events, sharing experience and knowledge, and supporting projects. Building resilience. Emergency plans for flooding, food, heat, practical and emotional support groups. Our powers do not stretch to enforcement of your homes or your streets or your businesses unless it's a planning or a drainage issue. So, town deal. Do you know about the town deal? Funding that came into this town? Okay. Town deal. I thought I'd better say a little bit about that too. So, council members, along with other unpaid residents, worked on a national funding bid. Well, we were more or less just allotted £24 million because of the ideas that came from the community. In fact, we're one of the only town deals in the country where all of them are grassroots, and I think there's like 11 different projects. Where are we? So after many consultations, it was agreed to raise the money for educational and training projects, including an open access university for apprenticeships, heritage infrastructure, including the crumbling old factories to make into community resources for new businesses support, community farm championing agroecology, and soil health. And a new site is being created for homeless and the non-bricks and mortar dwellers in Glastonbury, finally. All this is being done in constant consultation with our community. So this is actually a really exciting year to be Mayor of Glastonbury. So exciting. Oh. Thank you very much. Right, number 2. I'm now going to tell you about my plan. And this is my plan as Mayor of Glastonbury. So, I grew up in Glastonbury and then spent 35 of my years fighting for human rights and against the destruction of nature. I have learned to research, to fight legal battles, to petition and to take direct action. I am now back in my community to offer what I have learned about ecological breakdown and social resilience. I was elected Town Councillor of St Ben's Ward and then as Mayor, and my charity is the Glastonbury Mental Health Network. So my plan this year is to support and foster resilience and unity in our community through trust and shared knowledge. I have supported resilience events in Glastonbury using participatory democracy, informing and training our community in facilitation, active listening, using the people's assemblies to hear all voices. So, I believe in a well-functioning democracy depends on a well-informed public. So, these are some of the events I've done. Microphone a bit closer. Okay. Gosh, this is quite Okay, so, what have I done? So we ran, God, that feels weird. We ran a 5-mile food and farming resilience. So that's to find out exactly what food we do have in our 5-mile area and to big up farmers. This is for eco-agriculture, for feeding our community. This event also helped Plotgate to achieve the goal pledges of, I think, £200,000 to buy 2 fields for food growing and to start a river purification project. Deep Adaptation Conference. So this was for emotional and community resilience. We also raised £650 for Glastonbury Mental Health Network and a further £260 for Plotgate and for book sales. None of these projects cost the town any money. We just raised money. So future resilience events. 15th of October is Faith and Unity. So that's going to be, I think, here in the town hall. So I've got others. I don't have dates for them yet, but there's going to be a water health, so that's our springs and rivers. There's going to be land and homes, including soil, access to land, sustainable homes, and hopefully this will be a nice little camp out as well, so it'll be over the weekend. And I want to do a 5-mile mental health service conference. So please get in touch with me if you want to help in any of these resilience events. So thirdly, this is my opinions, I suppose, my learnings. Number 3, I'd like to address some of the topics from tonight. I'd like to address some of the topics in tonight's evening speakers. So net zero. Net zero, its a reason is that we as humans are using too much of Earth's resources. We should be mindful of our beautiful one planet. And its delicate ecology. Unfortunately, that's a very, very good heckle, absolutely. I'm not allowed to say that though. So, where was I? Unfortunately, it was the government who wrote this document, the Net Zero document, okay? And it was never intended to be acted upon. We had no illusions on that and have not taken this document seriously at all. Not allowed to say the Tories. Yes, basically the government, incompetent backhanding, greenwashing, carbon credit to print money. So this is from the scientist and lawyer, okay? This is scientist and lawyer. This was written, I think, probably within like a couple of months. So, the Department of Transport, this is from a lawyer who's also a scientist. The Department for Transport has recently had to admit that it made a huge miscalculation of carbon emissions from the UK road network, meaning the emissions from existing UK road traffic alone are enough to derail the UK carbon budgets and net zero goals. This is a key factor why the government's net zero strategy is in tatters and under threat of further legal action. This is not a document that we have ever prescribed to. It's literally just an indicator. Right, you'll like this next one. 15-minute cities. Which, I will repeat, Glastonbury has never had any plans for and never will. We did actually say this at the meeting, but never mind. Right, what is it? It's traffic calming measures, like London's low emission zones. It's because increased pollution is affecting health. But, yeah, really. But, I agree, okay? I agree. It is. What do I agree with? It's not a fair system. It's not a fair system. The poorer families and communities will pay. I have actively campaigned, okay, for freedoms of everyone, including the huge number who can't even afford a car. But I want them not to get stuck without local shops and services, and those get out-competed by big businesses in out-of-town shopping centres or online, okay? Who will get cushy tax breaks. It's also curious that all the 5 cities that are trialling the 15-minute cities are Labour, and it's the Tories that have stood up and said, no, we don't like them. I believe corporations and the national government do not have our best interests guiding their decisions. I do not agree with creeping surveillance capitalism that has come along with the US big tech domination of the internet. I don't agree with the lack of precautionary principle amongst 5G and other things. No, it's not. This is not a pantomime. The debate is later. So, oh, here we go, you'll like this one. And yet, I also know that the elites love conspiracy porn because it confuses the opposition. So I am angry that the hypocritical elites are misusing climate change for their money-making schemes, but that anger does not blind me from the changing climate and how CO2 is a significant factor in the recent warming. CFCs. Do we remember CFCs? Yeah? So, CFCs that punched a hole in the ozone layer. Yeah? Oh, no, that didn't happen either. Okay. They're measured by parts per trillion. Okay? Parts per trillion. The matters in life are relative amounts of things and not just the total amount. Cyanide is naturally occurring, but if we have 420 parts per million in our bodies, we would be dead. So, if it's not happy in Glastonbury, it's not on this paper. So it would be easy to say because CO2 is natural and measured in parts per trillion, that it can't matter as a heat-trapping greenhouse gas. I would argue that removing fossil fuels from our economies entirely appears to be impossible. Shifting everything to electric would cause great damage to pristine environments where the necessary of rare metals are located. CO2 reductions are important as they are warming gas, but to focus entirely on CO2 can distract us from the need to repair climate-moderating global cloud cover by stopping clouds. By stopping deforestation, clouds, trees, water, air, mountains, rivers, up again, yeah? Clouds. Thank you. Okay. Where are we? Sure, I've gone over 10 minutes. All right, I'm going to start again. By stopping deforestation, all right, enabling sustainable reforestation and shifting to greater agroforestry. All we can do now, here, today, and tomorrow, is to support Glastonbury to become resilient and united. Okay? Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Oh, do you want your bits back?
You did really well. You really did. All right. And yeah, you're doing it. You're going to put it on the next. You're muted, yeah? Yeah. You're muted, okay? Because I was going to say, watch what you're saying. Yeah. Just remember to unmute it.
I'll just introduce Ralph next, yeah? And I'll say
You've got
thank
a
you to
little bit
Indra.
of time, but I wanted to play that Dr. Patrick Moore thing now.
Oh, right, okay.
Because it's just speak.
Okay. Yeah, great. I'd like to thank Indra very much for her address. You know, I know that we have differing opinions, but we do have to let people speak and not heckle, if you would mind. Thank you. It can put people off their stroke, and there are things that Indra, was saying that I must admit I'm kind of agreed with. The corporatization of everything that's going on, and the taking over of public-private partnerships, and it's all about money. It's all about money, and I agree with her on that point. I know we differ on many points. I agree with her on that point. Right, right now, I think Eli's going to play Greenpeace co-founder Dr. Patrick Moore. He did a kind of 360 turn on climate, and he's going to speak in this film. Thank you.
Carbon dioxide is the currency of life, and the most important building block for all life on Earth. All life is carbon-based, including our own. Surely the carbon cycle and its central role as the foundation of life should be taught to our children, rather than the demonization of CO2 that carbon is a pollutant. We know for a fact that CO2 is essential, and that it must be at a certain level in the atmosphere for the survival of plants, which are the primary food for all the other species alive today. Should we not encourage our citizens, students, teachers, politicians, and other leaders to celebrate CO2 as the giver of life that it is? It is a proven fact that plants, including trees and all our food crops, are capable of growing much faster at higher levels of CO2 than present in the atmosphere today. Even at today's concentration of 400 parts per million, 0.04%, 0.04%, are relatively starved for nutrition. The optimum level of CO2 for plant growth is about 5 times higher, 2,000 parts per million. Yet the alarmists warn it is already too high. They must be challenged every day by every person who knows the truth in this matter. CO2 is the giver of life, and we should celebrate CO2 rather than denigrate it, as is the fashion today. We are witnessing the greening of the earth, as higher levels of CO2, due to human emissions from the use of fossil fuels, promotes increased growth of plants around the world. This has been confirmed by scientists with CSIRO in Australia, in Germany in research forests, and in North America in wild forests. Only half of the CO2 we are emitting from the use of fossil fuels is showing up in the atmosphere. The balance is going somewhere else. And the best science says most of it is going into an increase in biomass of global plant life. What could be wrong with that, as forests and agricultural crops become more productive?
patches.
Oh, it's okay, I'll shout. I've got a good shouty voice. Right now, I'd like to bring to the stage Professor Ralph Ellis, who is an amazing climate scientist.
Yeah.
Can this go in my pocket? Do you have any spares?
Yeah, well, we've got one up there.
Okay, you're good to go.
Is that?
The spare.
But it's on a lead. Okay, as long as it's long enough. Ah. Are we good to go? Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let's hope this works. Let's see if it will advance. So my name's Ralph Ellis, and my talk today is climate, energy, misinformation, and disinformation, because I think this subject is being very badly taught to the public. So, a little bit further away. Okay. So what does Ralph Ellis know about climate? Well, this is my latest peer-review climate paper, modulation of ice ages via precession and dust albedo feedbacks. Very successful, 45,000 downloads, and fairly controversial because it says that CO2 is not the major feedback agent controlling temperature. But we're not going to look at this apart from just one of the diagrams from this paper. And this is temperature versus CO2 during the ice ages. And you've got 800,000 years of data here. Temperature versus CO2 with all of the major ice ages from, well, nearly the last million years. And you can see that temperature and CO2 are in lockstep together. And some scientists have assumed from that CO2 is controlling temperature. But of course, you could say, correlation does not imply causation. You need some evidence for causation. Alternatively, you can look at this graph and you can say that every time CO2 is high, the world cools. And every time CO2 is low, the world warms. So you could say that high CO2 causes cooling and low CO2 causes warming. Now it's more complex than that, but you can probably see from this that there are other factors involved in temperature control on the planet. Because this would not happen if CO2 was a very strong feedback agent. So moving along, how did this all start, all of this climate caper? Well, it started with this graph, you're probably familiar, the hockey stick graph. This is 1,000 years of temperature derived from tree rings. And tree rings are not a very good proxy for temperature, but never mind. So how was this created? Well, we can probably see that from the Climate Gate emails. This is an email from Phil Jones to Ray Bradley, Michael Mann, and Keith Briffa. These are all climate scientists. And what does it say? It says, I've just completed Mike's nature trick. Oh, let's go back. So it says, I've just completed Mike's nature trick. Now, Mike is Professor Michael Mann, and Nature is the scientific journal Nature. I've just completed Mike's nature trick of adding in the real temperatures to each series for the last 20 years, from 1981 onwards and from 1961 for Keith Briffa's, in order to hide the decline. So what was the trick and what was the decline that they were hiding? Well, you can see that on Keith Briffa's data. So this was the tree ring data, again, from Keith Briffa. So this is 600 years of data. And you can see the temperature bubbles along for 550 years until we get to the mid-20th century, and then the temperature declines. The temperature goes down in the 20th century. Now, this is known as the divergence problem. The divergence problem says that tree rings record temperature exactly for hundreds of years until 1950, and then they don't. And if you believe that, I've got a bridge to sell you. So what do you do if you have this decline? This is the decline that they were trying to hide, the divergence problem. So what do you do if you have a decline? Easy, you chop off the end of the graph and you stitch in the temperature, the thermometer data, and lo and behold, you've got a hockey stick graph. So that is how the hockey stick graph was formed. That's why you see on the modern versions of it, you see a different colour at the end of it, because it is two data sets that have been stitched together. So climate science started with disinformation. I call that disinformation. And the disinformation has continued ever since. You're probably all familiar with this one. This is the BBC, of course. Who else? The BBC. BBC weather maps. Now, which is the warmer? It's the one on the left side, of course. So why the difference? Well, the one on the left side is from 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I think. The one on the right is a modern one. Now, the BBC came out and said the one on the right is to aid people with visual impairment. Now, who thinks the one on the right-hand side is easier and clearer than the one on the left? No, this was part of the agenda that the BBC was promoting. And this agenda has been all over in the media. So USA tornado numbers, I'm going to go just rapidly through a few of these. What's happening to US tornadoes? Well, we all know they're getting worse, they're getting stronger, there's getting more of them. Well, let's look at the data. The data here comes from the NOAA Storm Prediction Center, which is the go-to site for information on storms in the US. And this is giving 70 years of data. And as you can see, the strong tornadoes have been reducing for 70 years. And if you did not know that, why did you not know that? And where is the climate emergency in that data? The weather's getting better, not getting worse. The same happens if we look at hurricanes and typhoons. So what's happening to those? Well, we all know they're getting worse, they're getting stronger. Cities are being wiped out left, right, and center. Let's look at the data, and the data comes from Dr. Ryan Mao. Cyclone frequency, and this is over 40 years from satellite data. So if we look on the upper part of this graph, all cyclones have been decreasing for 40 years, according to the satellite data. And the strong, not tornadoes, these are tropical cyclones. This is hurricanes and typhoons. The strong ones have been steady, no change in 40 years. Again, it's not exactly what we're being told by the media. What do we have next? We have polar sea ice. Well, we all know the problem with sea ice. It's melting, the sea levels are going to rise, we're all going to drown. This is 40 years, again, of satellite data from the NSIDC, that's the National Snow and Ice Data Center in America, the go-to site for information on polar regions. And as you can see, the blue is the Arctic, and Arctic sea ice has been decreasing for 40 years. It's decreased by 20%. You might say that's a problem. But Antarctic sea ice has been increasing for 35 years, up until 2017 when there was a large storm down in the South Atlantic and it broke up the ice, but it's been recovering ever since. So where is the alarmism in that data, and why the disparity between north and south? CO2 is a global gas, it should have global effects. So why do we get a difference between north and south? Well, we don't actually know, nobody knows, but just as an example of the differences, this is the Arctic, this is Greenland, and it's not quite as pristine as you might expect. This is Chinese industrial dust on Greenland. And so we can see that not all climatic effects are CO2. There are other factors involved in temperature and climate. And, well, we can't finish without looking at polar bears, can we? Canary in the coal mine for the climate industry. Here's a quote from the BBC. Polar bears will be wiped out. Why the alarmist language? Wiped out. Why not reduced by a little bit? Anyway, wiped out by the end of the century unless more is done to tackle climate change, a study predicts. BBC, only from 3 years ago. This is pure disinformation because the BBC must have known about the graph of polar bear numbers, and this comes from Dr. Susan Crockford, who's been studying polar bears for like 35 years. And as you can see, polar bear numbers have been increasing for 60 years. Not only increasing, they've quadrupled over 60 years. Where is the wiped out in that data? This is why the BBC is giving disinformation. That's why the BBC is effectively the most unreliable news organisation known to man. But if you mention this in polite society, they will say 97% of scientists agree with anthropogenic global warming. No, they don't. Where did this come from? This came from this paper by John Cook et al., 2013. What did they do? They took 12,000 climate papers, of which 66% expressed no opinions, so they threw those out of the window. Of the remainder, 3% rejected global warming completely. Ergo, you might say, 97% of papers with an opinion supported global warming. It sounds like a cat food advert, doesn't it? For those of you old enough to remember that one. But that's not what the paper said. If you dig deeper into this paper, it said 24% of papers supported global warming, only 24%. Now, myself, as a CO2 skeptic, I would be a 24%er because there has been some warming. We don't quite know what is causing it. We don't quite know the magnitude. Nevertheless, there has been some warming, so I would be a 24%er. However, digging deeper into this paper, only 8% implicitly endorsed anthropogenic global warming, that it's all our fault. And only 0.5% of papers explicitly supported the IPCC version of anthropogenic global warming. So it was not 97%, it was 0.5%. That's the true figure. That's the true figure. And the problem here is that all climate scientists are paid to agree with anthropogenic global warming. He who pays the piper calls the tune. If you don't go along with it, you don't get a grant. I know about this because my paper was rejected by the Royal Society because it did not agree with anthropogenic global warming. So I had to go elsewhere to get it published. And if you don't go along with it, well, a bit like my experience, you end up like these climate scientists who were actually pushed out of their jobs because they disagreed with the agenda. That's the problem with modern academia. There is no freedom of speech, there's no freedom of research, there is no freedom within modern academia. That is a real problem that needs to be overcome. Now, I'll very quickly go through this because the previous video touched on this. What's the truth about CO2? Well, what's the difference between these plants? Well, CO2, of course. Those on the left had lots of CO2. Those on the right had very little. So the unspoken truth is that CO2 is plant food. And therefore, CO2 is the most essential gas in the atmosphere. Without CO2, all life on Earth will die. So where are we? We're sitting at 400 parts per million. Plants are doing reasonable. But as that little video said, if we had more CO2, plants would do better. That's why greenhouse growers pump up the CO2 in their greenhouses to 1,500 parts per million to make their plants grow quicker and stronger. Conversely, back in the last ice age, this is only 20,000 years ago, during the last ice age, CO2 came down to 190 parts per million. And as you can see, the plants are not doing very well. And up on the Gobi in north of China, on the highland plateau there, the equivalent CO2 came down to 150 parts per million, at which point all of the plants died. So, low CO2 equals plant death, which equals CO2 deserts. Now, you're probably familiar with precipitation deserts. If there's not enough water, the plants die, you get a desert. The same happens with CO2. If there's not enough CO2, the plants die, and you get a CO2 desert. And that's what happened 20,000 years ago up on the Gobi Plateau. Conversely, during the Jurassic era, CO2 was 2,500 parts per million. That's 6 times higher than now. And the biosphere was fine. In fact, the large size of dinosaurs was in part due to extra CO2. More CO2 equals bigger plants, equals bigger herbivores, equals bigger carnivores. That was the Jurassic era. So don't let any uneducated teenagers tell you that CO2 is bad for the biosphere. It's good for the biosphere. Brings us on to energy policy. That's probably why we're here, because it's affecting energy policy. But I don't think we've got an energy policy. I think we've got an energy fantasy, because I think the ministers in Westminster don't know what they're doing. Sorry, Andrew, but you might actually agree with me. So let's look at UK electrical generation by type, and you'll see that most of it is the yellow, which is gas. And on the left here, we've got purple and blue, which is wind, solar, and bio. And so now we have renewables at 39%. And you might say, hooray, that's wonderful, we're going renewable. Well, not quite, because that blue sector on the left, this one here, this is Drax the Destroyer. Drax used to be our largest coal-fired power plant, 4 gigawatts, so it's pretty big. It's now burning trees, and last year it burnt 18 million tons of trees, and that figure will go up to 27 million tons of trees per year. So you're being told, plant a tree, Drax is burning them. So is that a good idea? I'll leave that with you. The other problem is that UK fossil fuels is only 1/40th of the amount being burnt in China for their electricity. So let's have a look at the Chinese pie chart just for a bit of contrast. Here it is, and it's mostly black. It's mostly coal. That's a problem, because if you look down here on the left-hand side, UK is 16 gigawatts of fossil fuels for our electrical generation, and most of that is gas, which is fairly clean. And China is 615 gigawatts, mostly coal, which is pretty dirty. So if we wanted to represent the UK on the right-hand side, that's the UK in comparison with China. So whatever we're doing is a drop in the ocean in comparison with China. The other problem is China reducing? Well, no, because last year they built 50 gigawatts of coal. So 3 times more than the UK has. They were just commissioning those coal-fired power stations just last year. So We can destroy our economy in Europe and in the UK, and it will have no difference whatsoever on CO2 emissions if you think CO2 is a problem, which I don't. The other problem is that total energy that we use is much more than electricity. The government seems to be fixated on electricity, but total energy is much larger. So this is the electrical generation pie chart, the one we've just seen. I want you to have a look at this red, which is oil. Now, if we go to total energy looks like this. Okay, so now oil is much larger, gas is much larger, and renewables are only 16% of total energy. Why? Because you've got to take into account transport, space heating, and what's the other one? Industry. And when you add all of those in, it's 4 times the amount of energy that we're actually producing by electricity. So the problem is power generation needs to increase by 400%, 4 times. So where are those power stations being built, whatever they are, whether they're solar, wind, or nuclear, where are they being built? Because as you know, these projects are like 20-year projects. They don't happen overnight. So where do we go from here? Oh yes, we go to backup storage. This is another canary in the coal mine, as it were. We need backup. So this is a chart of electrical generation for December 2021. And as you can see, the blue goes missing. The blue is wind. So the blue, yeah, there we go. We get a 6-day wind outage of wind. Now, you get much longer. The longest I've seen is a 21-day outage of wind. But we also have no solar. Solar is the yellow. There is no solar in the winter. Don't let people try to tell you that you get solar power in the winter in the UK. There is none for the whole of December 2021, none. So we've got a 6-day wind outage, and we've got to cover that. How do we cover that? Well, we cover it by gas. That's the purple, is gas. But the government wants to get rid of gas by 2035. If that goes, we're going into the dark, unless we have some sort of backup storage. We need 10 days of backup storage. How much energy is that? Well, easy to calculate. For 10 days, to back up half of our grid, not all of it, is 4,800 gigawatt hours of energy. Don't worry about the units, just look at the magnitude of it, because that's not the total problem. We've not accounted for transport and space heating and everything else. So total energy, electricity is only 25% of total energy. So we need to multiply by 4, giving us 19,000 gigawatts of energy, stored energy, for when the wind and the solar are not working. The trouble is, we've only got 10. So we need 19,000 gigawatt hours, we've only got 10 gigawatt hours. That is a problem that needs to be addressed. What sort of storage do we have? Well, we have de Noorweg, of course, which is a pumped storage system. Basically, you pump water up and then let it flow back down again, and you generate electricity. This is de Noorweg, well worth a visit. If you're up in Snowdonia, it's called Electric Mountain. Now, the problem is, even if we could increase de Noorweg to 30 gigawatt hours, we would need 600 de Noorwegs. Where on earth are we going to build 600 de Noorwegs? And how long will that take? The government science advisor, we'll come on to him in a minute, suggested that we flood all of the Welsh valleys. And I don't think they'll be very pleased about that. So how much will this cost us? De Noorweg, in today's money, was 1.7 billion. So if we multiply that up, total cost of storage, 1,000 billion. A nice round trillion. That's good. And we can confirm that figure by the new one, which is Corrie Glass up in Scotland, and that is the upper pond for the storage system in Scotland. They're building right now. And again, if we multiply that up, it comes to a total cost of 950 billion. So that's a fairly good estimate of the costs involved, a huge amount. So the government is not serious about Britain converting to electric generation using renewable energy unless they address the energy storage problem. Now, the government has known about this for a decade or two because they were told about this by Professor Mackay, who was the previous government science advisor. And he wrote this little booklet, Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air. It's available online. I advise you go and have a read of it. It's got a few fanciful bits in it, but nevertheless, there's some good information there. And he came out. The trouble is, Mackay, he was a greenie, but he could not make renewables work for the UK. He was really struggling. So he came out with 5 plans for how we could go renewable in the UK. And so these are the 5 plans, and you can see that there are major blocks of power on each one, and then lots of little bits down below. So the major blocks are these. These are the costings. For 60%, not all of our power, this is just for 60% of our power. So offshore wind, obviously we can have wind. How much will we need? Well, 100 Hornsea 3s. Hornsea 3 is the largest wind farm in the world being built out in the North Sea. We will need 100 of those at a cost of 850 billion. That's based on a 35% capacity factor. Trouble is, they wear out after 25 years, so you've got to do that all over again. That's another 850 billion. The wind doesn't always blow, so you've got to have a backup system. That's 1,000 billion. Total cost, nice, 2,700 billion. And is that going to get ready by 2035 or 2050? No, it's not. The other one he suggested was solar in the Sahara. He recognized quite well that solar does not work in the UK. So he said we'll put the solar panels in the Sahara where the sun is more reliable. Sounds good, but it's a real fantasy, this one. So how much would that cost? Well, we would need 3,900 Wroughton airfields. Wroughton Airfield is the big solar plant just south of Swindon, at a cost of 320 billion. Quite a snip, you might say. But of course, they wear out after 25 years, so you've got to replace them. Then you've got to rent the land. It's not our land, and you've got to rent the land through France and Spain to get the cable back here again. I costed that at 30 billion per year, so that's 1,500 billion over 50 years. And then you've got to build this cable. This is really a problem. Now I based this on the Swedlink in Germany. The Swedlink goes from northern Germany to southern Germany, and they're having real problems building that cable. But the problem is we need 340 Swedlinks, because it's a lot further to go down to the Sahara, 3,100 billion. And then you need a storage backup system, because the sun doesn't always shine in the Sahara. They have nights there as well. So that's 1,000 billion. So you're talking about 6,240 billion, and that's not going to be ready by 2035. None of that is going to be ready. The other one he was looking at, it's had a bad rap over the last 40 years or so, is nuclear power. How much would that cost? Well, we've got a good example down here at Hinkley Point in Somerset. Trouble is, we will need 30 Hinkley Points, 600 billion. And does anyone think we can build 30 nuclear power stations by 2035 or 2050? It's not going to happen, is it? Good thing about nuclear power is it's reliable, so we don't need the backup. But we do need fuel, and the fuel comes in at 220 billion over a 50-year lifespan. So we're talking about 820 billion. The other problem with this is we're supposed to have a green revolution from this. We're supposed to have a green economy. Are we? Because if you look at Hornsea 3, it's being built by a Danish company using Swedish turbines, using German gearboxes and generators, and Japanese cables. Where is the benefit for Britain in that? Solar in the Sahara, you can bet they're going to be built in China, aren't you? And the cables will be built in Germany and Japan. And nuclear power, well, it's being built by the Chinese and the French. EDF in France is building it. Okay, so in summary, what have we learned? CO2 is the most essential gas in the atmosphere. Without CO2, all life on Earth will die. CO2 is not a very powerful greenhouse gas. Peter Taylor's going to talk about this, but basically the models have exaggerated the effects of CO2. Climate change is not as bad as advertised. We've seen that the tornadoes and the hurricanes are reducing. Most renewable energy needs stored backup, and the government is not even looking at stored backup yet. Mandating electric vehicles and electric heating without the generating capacity to underpin it is an absolute folly. However, alternative energy supplies are required because we will run out of fossil fuels at some point. I don't know if you know, but we reached peak coal in 1913. We reached peak gas and peak oil in 1999. We in this country are running out of fossil fuels, fracking aside. So we do need alternative supplies over the next 100 years, 200 years. I suggest that we need 60% nuclear power. The French have 80% and they're doing quite well, and their energy costs for electricity are nearly half of ours at present. So I think we ought to follow the French example. I don't think I've ever said that before, but I think in this case we should follow the French example. The trouble is that uranium is a limited resource because the fast breeder reactor program has failed. Now, I've seen quotes that we have only got 200 years, 250 years of easily available uranium before we start running out of uranium-235 if everybody in the world goes to nuclear power. So that's a bit of a problem. The alternative is thorium. Here he is. Thorium power. Now, thorium power works. The Americans made a thorium reactor back in the 60s. It works, and it has some advantages. We've got plenty of thorium around. I've seen quotes of 10 million years of thorium. We've got 200 years of thorium sitting in waste dumps at present because it's a waste product. You don't get the long life waste products, so none of this 20, 30,000 year waste products. All of the waste products are 200 year, 300 year waste products. And you can't make nuclear weapons from thorium. So it has lots of advantages. The problem is there is no investment from the government. I don't think they even know what thorium power is, let alone the benefits it can give us. And finally, the government is not serious about keeping the lights on and maintaining our wealth and prosperity. So that is the end of my talk, and the takeaway I hope from this one is don't panic. The world is not going to end in 5 years like an uneducated teenager told us, and the world is not going to end in 12 years like an uneducated member of Congress told us. So let's take our time about this. Let's formulate a reasonable and rational policy for our energy future. Thank you.
Is everyone listening? Yes, come on. Shush. Yeah, we're going to start with a short film. It's Dr. Shiva, and he was a systems analyst. He worked at MIT for a number of years, and he's really exposing the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as a money-making operation. So here you go.
I love him, Dr. Shiva.
Yeah.
Actually. Yeah, he's fun.
Oh yeah. Have some image.
recognize that many people who are supporting the Paris Accords, if you ask them, why should we have been in this, give me one benefit, no one can really give any benefit. In fact, I haven't had anyone rationally explain even one benefit. But I'm going to explain to you very quickly here so everyone can understand in very simple ways is why it was important that Donald Trump got out of this, why it was essentially going to support an international collusion to basically support the polluting of our environment, and more importantly, to basically tax all of us, businesses, small businesses, big businesses, primarily a lot of small businesses, and every consumer here with a carbon tax. And it's a very simple exposition of this, and I hope I make it clear to you. And obviously, if you have questions, we're periscoping, you're welcome to join us. First of all, let me explain something very basic here. So, in this circle, let's consider the fact that we have a lot of businesses here. These are businesses throughout the world. And these businesses, are producing different things.
And let's assume these are typically manufacturing businesses. They take resources, raw materials, they process stuff, and out comes products from these businesses, which typically go to the consumer. There are a lot of consumers here. This is, you and me over here. And we buy these products and we pay this company some dollar amount. Now, many of these companies, because of the manufacturing process, do put out carbon and CO2 into the environment. Let's call that broadly, pollution, okay? Pollution, the term of CO2, all right? So these are these greenhouse gases that they emit into the atmosphere. This is, let's call it before the Paris Accords. This is what's taking place. Again, businesses take resources, they create products, we buy them, and we pay some fee for them, and these businesses have been polluting. Now, has anything changed post the Paris Accords? And let's use the date 2030, as this is supposed to be an important date for the Paris Accords. So what happens here? Here again, I'm going to draw the same circle. We have the businesses, and let's put the year now 2030. And what occurs in 2030? These businesses still exist, let's say. Again, these are the businesses. And they are creating products, as I mentioned before, to us as consumers. Same situation. This is again you and me. And these consumers pay some fee for these products. And guess what? They're still polluting. And I'll give you some numbers on this. In fact, they're polluting a lot more, as we'll see. But something very interesting happens. For the pollution they do, they have to now pay an organization, which I'm going to call, in double quotes, the IPCC. And this group is composed of people like Al Gore, people like the Bushes, many people from the commodities market, and essentially a global elite in here of quote-unquote scientists. A dollar goes here, dollars go in, and these people deliver these people something called carbon credits. And what this allows these companies to do now is to pollute, but in order to pollute, they have to pay this organization a fee, and this organization issues carbon credits. In fact, it gets even more interesting. These carbon credits, if you look at the commodities market, the global commodities market, these carbon credits are bought and sold here on this commodities market to people. And this generates the ability for this group to generate trillions, not billions, let me explain, trillions of dollars in new source of wealth. So these carbon credits were created by this group as a vehicle to essentially charge polluters something, and this group has a potential to make trillions and trillions of dollars. So how did this all happen, and what was the Paris Accords? Well, the front end for this entire organization, by the way, Al Gore substantially, at a certain point, monopolized and had access to a large number of carbon credits, which he had accumulated, and his goal was to have a payday by forcing these businesses in the future, around post-2030, to buy these carbon credits. And if you actually look at this, the IPCC's PR, I call it their PR machine, was what we call the Paris Accords. The Paris Accords was really their PR engine, to get this out as though everyone needed to get on board. And what the U.S., if you look at the United States here, put the flag here, the U.S. Was being forced by the IPCC. By the way, this included establishment Democrats and establishment Republicans, who were essentially telling the U.S. government that it needed to create what we call a green fund. And this green fund, and I'll explain what this was really about, the U.S. was going to have to put $100 billion into this green fund. And what was this $100 billion for? Well, remember, the countries who are polluting really didn't want to be part of this. They didn't really want to be part of the Paris Accords. Why? Because they have to pay fees to the IPCC. So how do you get them to be part of this? So if I do this over here, what I call the influencers of these countries, influencers of countries. So for example, if you take India, China, and you go down the list of what they call about 190 plus countries, remember all these people have influencers, so-called advisors. This $100 billion number was going to be funneled through different NGOs to essentially pay off, and in fact, people have already gotten agreements that if they join the Paris Accords, that they're going to get dollars funneled to them. This is why people are involved in this. In fact, some of the WikiLeaks stuff came out. Jairam Ramesh, one of the key advisors in India, originally, if you go look at it, he said that the glaciers were not receding, and later on it was stated that the glaciers were receding. And in a recent email in WikiLeaks, he was actually thanking John Podesta for making all of this occur. So you have to really start thinking about what took place. But fundamentally, Trump wanted to exit this because I think Trump realized what was really going on. And what was really going on is this. The mafia of the IPCC was using the United States instrument, our Congress, our tax dollars, to funnel about $100 billion here, so we would pay off these people to join the Paris Accords. Now, let me just tell you, $100 billion is a relatively small amount because these guys were going to make trillions. So let me follow this through again so you get it. Businesses today are polluting. Just to give you an example, China today pollutes around 11 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere. 11 billion tons of carbon. That's what they're doing today. By 2030, between now and 2030, guess what? China's still allowed to pollute. In fact, China is allowed to go up to 22 billion tons, which means they're allowed to go 11 billion tons in carbon, which means they're going to pollute more. They're going to double their pollution during this period. No penalties. And that's how they got China to join. After 2030, there's going to be a big payday for these guys because they're going to be able to sell China carbon credits. I hope everyone's following. The bottom line is, these set of 190, in many ways, so-called influencers and advisors, many of them essentially are waiting for this $100 billion payday, supported the Paris Accords because they're going to be paid, and that's how they force their countries' prime ministers and people to say, yeah, we got to join this Paris Accords. The reality is, when you step back and look at this diagram, who really profits is the oligarchs, who are going to make money on carbon credits as they fluctuate and rapidly grow in price post-2030. So a $100 billion payout to most of these corrupt officials is very well worth it for them because they're going to have a 100 to 1,000% increase in profits. So fundamentally, what Donald Trump did was he saw the scam, which is what it is. And fundamentally what this does is makes liberal bourgeois feel good that they're part of the Paris Accords. In fact, the MIT president has said, we have conclusive evidence that temperature has gone up. Let me just make it very clear that Hansen, the guy who came up with this temperature rating at NASA, during the 1950s to 1990, they used what they said was the average temperature, 1998, during that period. That's how they measured the average temperature. And they said the average temperature was 15 degrees Celsius. And they predicted in around 1988, that temperature was going to go up. So again, in 1988, papers are starting to come out saying the average temperature measured between 1950 to 1980 is 15 degrees, and they're saying, temperature is going to rise on the planet Earth. Well, what happens? By 1995, 1996, they find out the temperature actually, in fact, gone down a little bit. It was not going up. And somehow, mysteriously, around 2002, Hansen says, yes, the temperature has gone up. And how did he get it to go up? He got it to go up by saying that the average temperature is now 14 degrees. He actually changed the goalpost. Before it's 15, he said now it's 14, and he said we're measuring 14.64. So what they did was a complete lie, and in fact this changing of the goalpost was done in an email. All of this is written in a beautiful article by Arvind Kumar, an American thinker, called 14 is the new 15, or 14 is the new 15, exactly. So you should go read it by Arvind Kumar, an American thinker. He lays it out very beautifully. But the bottom line is, there is no conclusive evidence that the temperature has gone up if you look at the facts. This entire process really profits this group. The reality is China is going to continue to pollute 2x, 200% more. India also gets to pollute from 2 billion to 4 billion. In fact, we're going to drop our carbon emissions from 5 billion to 4 billion. So this entire process is really a big racket. So all of us, when I go back to this as a consumer, guess what? In the future, we're actually going to pay more for products. Businesses are going to be charged more. So businesses are paying taxes. Each consumer's product is going to go up. These guys up here are the ones who are going to make money. So extremely good that Donald Trump pulled out of this. This was a patriotic thing to do, and we need to start really exposing the mainstream media and the elite academics who are all actually behind this. Thank you.
Not far from here. And welcome, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, right, yes, thank you. Okay. So I'm local. This is my town. And I thought I would dress up today because I've got this kind of split personality. There are many people here who know me as I hang out with dancers, musicians, shamans, and that's where I feel comfortable. But I have this other personality, which is actually a serious scientist, and this is my serious scientist suit. So I thought I would explain why I can talk to you about climate, because I'm a general ecologist. I have a couple of degrees from Oxford University, and I spent 20, 30 years as an environmental scientist. And environmentalists are getting a bit of a bad press these days because we all know why. But without them, I mean, we were very active in the 70s and 80s. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Test Ban Treaty. I worked with the scientists who fought for that. Organic farming, that was unheard of. My research group in Oxford was the first scientific group that took it seriously, and we did a comparative study of organic and conventional farming, first of its kind. And then the World Wildlife Fund headhunted my top guy, and he went to Geneva. For 12 years, we focused on ocean pollution. So there's no more radioactive waste dumping in the ocean. And eventually, with the help of Greenpeace and Greenpeace International, we stopped that. We stopped a lot of things in the 80s. The oceans are a lot cleaner than they would be. Plastic, that wasn't on my watch. Somebody wasn't watching that carefully enough. But environmentalists did a good job. We also stopped something called the plutonium economy. I was living in Germany at the time, and this was using fast reactor technology that actually breeds more fuel, so it would last forever. And plutonium would be used much like any other fuel in a power station except that 1 microgram is the lethal dose, it's highly toxic. And 1 kilogram would give you maybe 100 Hiroshimas. So then you've got to think about, how do you control a technology like that? And you have to keep a lot secret from the people, especially those who might live near one of those stations. So we broke all that open. And at that time, we could do computer modeling. We had teams. I had the most wonderful mathematicians and physicists to work with. People who'd left the system, and they would not get paid properly. So we put in a big shift. And roughly the middle of the 90s, I thought, well, I've done enough. I want to do something more creative. So I involved myself in forest strategies, wildlife strategies, and so forth. And then in 97, due to the breakdown of a relationship, I ended up here in Glastonbury. It was the only place that actually offered accommodation for a guy on his own with 2 children and no money. So I really love this place. It's a real community. And there's one thing, though, that I've learned being here, and that is, as an Avalonian, we have a different perspective on things. An Avalonian perspective. What is an Avalonian perspective on climate change, net zero, the Green New Deal? In an Avalonian perspective, we understand science. There are scientists here. I'm one of them. Michael White is here. We understand politics, science and politics. But we also understand soul, the world of spirit. And it was during the time that I was here, and eventually I got back into consulting, the work in Oxford had brought us right the way up to the UN. I've been in all the corridors of power, parliaments, European Union, and including the UN. And I've seen science policy and how it works. So when I was here, I was much more interested in doing ecological work. But we did something that I thought was necessary. And if I can get this to work, I'll come back to that in a minute, which was to visualize, because this was 20 years ago, 23 years ago, the Royal Commission produced a plan for Britain to 2050, bringing down fossil fuel use by half. At the moment, net zero, we want all of it to go, but then it was just half. And the Royal Commission produced a report. I was asked to review it. I thought, wow, all these biomass stations, we don't have the forests for that. The barrages will lose all the estuaries, the wild places, turbines everywhere. And it's a godsend for nuclear power. They're going, oh, we're carbon free. So I thought, okay, I talked to my friends in the government, Countryside Agency particularly, and persuaded them that we needed to visualize. At that time, consultants' reports were all little drawings on, black and white drawings on reports. You wouldn't want to read them. So I said, well, we've got amazing technology these days to visualize landscapes. Take a look at, what the kids are doing with it. It's all shoot-'em-up games. Surely we could produce some software that we could imagine a landscape, what we've got now and what it would look like in 2050. And amazingly, I haven't seen Richard Fraser here, but I thought, well, I haven't got the skills to do that, really. I go look around, and there was a little shop just down on North Oak Street called Visionscape, just photocopies and stuff like that. And there was a guy huddled up at the back there, and I got chatting to him. Turned out he was actually one of the best fantasy landscape designers in the world, right? So we hooked up. We put a proposal through to the government. They were very keen, they funded it, and I'll show you some of the results. And this is 20 years ago, and we were leading edge. And that project finished around 2003, and I thought, my goodness, if we deal with, and this, at that time, as an ecologist, I had never studied the carbon dioxide models. I'd accepted them. That's the physicists. They know what they're talking about. What concerned me was what would happen to the landscape, communities that live there, and the wildlife, particularly the wilderness, the wild land. We don't have real wilderness here. But this is a global thing. And I thought, and people in Friends of the Earth were coming to me and saying, look, Peter, we've got to sacrifice the landscape. The Hebrides, Snowdonia, all of these places. And at that time, wind turbines were just coming in, and I thought, how many do we need exactly, and how many biomass stations, and where's the biomass? So I thought, I'm going to study this. And I spent 3 years studying the science without funding. And I produced a report because I could see it's just going to destroy everything. It's going to destroy the soul of the landscape. And so I finished around 2008. I got on a plane. I went to see a former head honcho of Greenpeace International. They know me, they knew me. They weren't now the current directors, or then the current directors. And he was going, oh, Peter, you're usually right. I said, yeah, this carbon dioxide model is the worst science I've seen. It's really bad. There's no cycles in the models. It's all linear. I can't believe it. We were really good at entering models, criticizing them, altering the parameters. And in those days, we could do our own model. Now you'd need $3 million to match one of these models. So I thought, okay, here's the results. The models are really bad, and you cannot rely on them. And it's very difficult to work out, but I think we've got a lot more time than is made out. And he said, oh, you have to talk to our man in the UN. I said, Remy Parmentier is quite famous in Greenpeace. He was the main man for the whaling thing, when they boarded the ships and everything. And I said, you have a man in the UN? But they were always the problem. And he didn't get it. He was already a UN consultant on water issues, which is okay. But anyway, I thought I would list to you some of the things, because really, you can't tell. If I show you loads of graphs like Ralph did, as a layperson, you can't really tell. And on the other side of this argument, you've got every single science institute in the world, all the academies, every country, every government, the European Commission and the United Nations, all telling you that we've got a serious climate emergency. So why on earth would you listen to me? It's like with all of that, well, the issue is authority. And that's really the nub of it. And that's what I want to say. Who really here has any idea of the mistakes that the UN scientists have made? They set up committees for everything. Do you remember a time when they used to x-ray pregnant women? Anybody? That's a long time ago. It took 20 years to stop that. There was a special UN committee, and they defended the practice. Our models say it shouldn't have any effect. One single scientist, Dr. Alice Stewart, got the data. Well, here's my data. Those women who've been x-rayed have more leukemia in their children. She was vilified. She was blocked everywhere. They tried to stop her publishing. That's when you saw the dark side of science. And the guy who opposed her, who's called Edward Pochin, he was a radiobiologist, and I used to be actually a member of the same institute as him. He was knighted, Sir Edward Pochin. Alice Stewart, no honours whatsoever. Not a word in our parliament. That's just x-rays. CFCs, we nearly lost the ozone layer. Thankfully, the scientific world woke up in time and the UN complied. But what's not really told is CFCs were licensed in the first place by UN scientists. You can even find bits of writing which said, oh, we're dealing with, because they used to clean the computers with it. It evaporates, and it doesn't leave any residue. And this is the least toxic substance known to mankind, was the CFCs when they were licensed for total, absolute, uncontrolled disposal. That was the UN. My particular area of expertise was controlling discharges and dumping. The UN licensed all of that. They licensed PCBs, which you can now find that toxic substance in virtually every whale, every dolphin, every seal. And it's an immunosuppressant, so they get more disease. It's a gender bender, which they only discovered much more later, and it's a carcinogen. So now, you're not allowed to dispose it just anywhere, but they licensed it. And we still had to battle and say, look, certain substances that you think are harmless, they're fabricated, they're not natural, and they persist in the environment, you should not do it. We fought, I would say, 10 years to get clean production technology, stop the discharges, all of that. So I saw within that process how science works. The opposition, the people on the committees, particularly that committee to do with radiation. And I also saw some very brave people, men and women, professors within the academic world, risk their careers to stand up, including a good friend of mine. So get a bit. So it's dissident scientists and that process and their relation to authority that you need to look at. So I'll give you one very recent example. I got an invite, very unusual for me, to the Royal Society of Medicine about 2 weeks ago. So, okay, I had to find my suit. And there were all professors there, and particularly one coming over from the United States. And they were there to look at 5G. But all the data is actually 4G. And the professor who I was talking to had been asked to sit on a special commission in New Hampshire. So a whole state, they were concerned, everybody was going on about 5G. And so, well, we'll set up our own commission and we'll get experts from the industry, so we won't be biased, we'll be fair. And this was an expert from the industry. And when he saw the data, he went on the warpath. And I couldn't talk to him. I tried to go and say thank you for coming over here at his own expense, risking his academic career. And I couldn't. I welled up, because that's what happened to a former professor, Edward Radford, who came over, and he led the battle against the X-raying of pregnant women and various other things to do with the low-level radiation. So, issues of authority and what's going on right now. Well, Ralph did a really brilliant job of ClimateGate. That's 10 years ago. There's two very recent lessons last year. And one of them, actually, I've learned a lot from the whole COVID issue. And I'm sure you have. And so, in fact, I wrote an article in New View on COVID, climate, and conspiracy. I know people who are completely obsessed and consumed by conspiracy. It's like a psychological illness, really. It's horrible. But conspiracies do exist, and I'll give you two examples. One is recently COVID, and I'm talking about this now because it's about science and it's about authority. Some people here, including me, knew that that virus had come from a lab right at the beginning. That's because we have a different kind of antenna, a different radar. And some people here may even actually be able to leave their bodies and go have a look. A group of scientists, but first of all there was, it is a conspiracy theory that it's come from a lab. A group of scientists got together and wrote a paper in Nature, the top scientific journal, 12 leading virologists or professors. It's absolutely implausible. We've seen the codes, we've looked at the RNA and everything. It's not come from a lab. Quash the conspiracy theory. And of course, all the governments listen to that. It's Nature and so forth. Very recently, I actually wrote to all the party leaders and all the editors of all the newspapers, and I said, one particular thing I wanted, and I asked the Prime Minister, I didn't get a reply to any of this, ask the intelligence services what they know. What are they advising you? Well, I didn't get very far, except that a former head of MI6 joined with a virology professor, and they did a paper saying, we think it could be coming from a lab. They got it through, not in the highest journals, as long as they took out any reference to China. So that paper was very, very influential. Now, in the United States Congress has subpoenaed all of the emails from that group of scientists and also their intelligence services, all the email traffic. And there you see it. These scientists talking to each other and saying, we've got to quash this conspiracy theory, it's quite likely that it came from a lab. Half of the people who signed that paper thought it did come from a lab. But we must not allow that to get out because it's not good for science. Pharmaceuticals, by the way, are the biggest investment opportunity on the planet today. And it's not good for our relations with China, and I'll come to that in a minute. That's how science operates. I was asking a question maybe 3 or 4 months ago. I was trying to get a paper through the system. Over the last 10 years, I've been working with a professor in the States, one of the ones who took the risks in the past in relation to ocean stuff. And there's a whole story about how I got together with him, and we've produced 4 or 5 papers. I should be referring to one in a minute, which is very important. But I'm just losing my track here a little bit. That climate issue that we were talking about, the hockey stick, that reappeared in the latest IPCC report, the 6th report, was published in 2021. And I'm aghast because it was heavily criticized when they first tried it on in 2001. It was called the hockey stick controversy. It was called Hide the Decline. There are books about it. So it's like, how come it's back? And the world's paleoclimatologists who know about cycles are not standing up and going, hey, at least professors of virology were challenging the authority. And then my friend at Exeter University sent me a copy of a paper, and it was 22 paleoclimatologists, experts in cycles, people who cannot be ignored, saying, we're really disgusted, in scientific language, with what's been happening with this resurrection of the hockey stick. And then they spell it out. The IPCC is biased. It selects the scientists for its committees. It selects the papers that it refers to, and it simply ignores a whole tranche of science. So luckily, when I was writing my paper, I didn't have to say that. I'm nobody. These guys are saying it. It cannot be ignored. So the upside of this is that science is beginning to move. And before, in the 70s and the 80s, the UN admitted its fault of dilute and disperse for any toxic material. The ocean can take it. And we've got loads of monitoring labs, and we've got loads of scientists working on it. And we said, look at all the things that have gone wrong. We need the precautionary principle. We need clean production technology that doesn't produce these toxics. Open up a clean production center, which they did. And then they even asked me to come in and help them redraft the legislation so that there wouldn't be any loopholes. So that is possible. And in 2019, as a result of our work with the US professor, who's really distinguished and very competent scientist, we were invited to present, and I went over to Prague, it's a major conference, and presented our work. And I thought, oh, nobody's going to listen. But they actually said, would you do the keynote, please? I thought, wow, okay. And there was there the UN's top modeler. And I pinned him down in front of the conference. And you know, what you're saying and what I'm saying completely at loggerheads. They don't agree. He said, yeah, we don't do cycles very well. Why don't you tell the public that? And then we had lunch, and he said, come to Princeton. Come talk to us. Then COVID came. By the way, it's not that easy for me to fly to Princeton. And, even just going to a conference will cost you $1,000. 5 minutes? So none of this was funded by the oil industry, by the way. Most of the critical scientists I know really struggle for funding, and there's certainly no oil industry money. Something that film you saw talked about Al Gore and what's happening there with the IPCC, carbon credits, the whole deal. It's massive. It's absolutely massive. And China is the key. The Kyoto Protocol, which I have a professor friend in the States who actually helped to draft it, it got China special permission to go through the roof with its carbon emissions. Meanwhile, the West gets constrained. You don't have to be an economist to know that there's a massive flow of industrial production to China. Why? No environmental regulations. Most of the population live in cell blocks, imprisoned, social credit systems, surveillance, massive surveillance. No spirituality is allowed. Something like Tai Chi or Falun Gong, they're on you. That's necessary for the global financial system to operate. Every single technology that the Green New Deal wants to implement relies on rare metals mostly. Lithium's not so rare, but it takes a lot to mine it. China holds the monopoly in every single one. Not only that, it builds a lot of the turbines, it builds a lot of the solar panels, it builds 85% of the electric vehicles. That is where the jobs and the money is going, and this whole mesmer of climate emergency is allowing that. It's fueling that.
It's not a racial issue, it's a human issue, and it's a greed issue.
Yes, it's a total, it's an issue of soul.
Really clear, that it's not about the Chinese, it's about greed and capitalism and neoliberalism.
I agree. Yeah. In fact, I use the word China, but actually, what is China? It was transformed by the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation in '91, and what was a communist country, not that it was a very nice one, what was a communist country suddenly became capitalist. It opened up to massive investment. The investment flow to China prior to COVID was 200 billion a year. Post-COVID, 400 billion. So I just want to end with a little graphic, because we struggled to get this. The Kogi tribe in Colombia, these are their mamas, these are their shamans. And the message of the Kogi, which was in 1990, and it influenced a lot of us, wake up little brothers. It's all about the right relationship to the land. I don't know how to get this to advance. Oh, there we go. Right relationship to the land. Net zero is global. As we saw, all the governments have signed up for it. Now, we've exhausted our hydro reserves. We couldn't build much more. This is planned hydro in wild places where indigenous peoples live. That's a hydro dam in Brazil. You can hardly see the people, they're so small. Indigenous people live there, and you know how they're treated. This is Southeast Europe, the last areas of wild rivers, many national parks. Those are landscape sacrifice dots, hydro dams primarily. In Colombia, the indigenous people are protected and the primary forest is protected, but the people in between who are not indigenous and the kind of mixed race and so forth, and they live like peasants, 400,000 acres were cleared for British biofuels. And it now has one of the biggest displaced persons problem in the world. Fracking nightmare. So many people saying, "Oh, we just need to frack." That was really my turning point when I was trying to introduce the idea of soul and the healing forest to the conservation community. That's a very, very difficult task. But in that process, when we were doing the landscape work, this is Richard Fraser's work, we visualized, that's a landscape of, say, somewhere like West Wales. We also did an eastern landscape. I won't show all of them. And so what we did was to look at how it could be developed insensitively. So turbines on the hilltops, commercial forestry, forest residue power stations. The alternative, well, it's got a mind of its own. The alternative, sensitive development, low profile power. There's actually a power station there. Turbines not on the tops of the hills, all kinds of things where you could take care. And one of the elements of that was get the turbines out to sea, much more space and you can't see them and so forth. And actually the government listened. This project went to every county council in the land through the Countryside Agency. And it could have gone further as a tool for each community. We could even do that here. Each community to map what it has in the way of its landscape, its biodiversity, its communities, and just see what it can actually fit in, what the technologies are, what are their consequences, what are the supply lines, where's it coming from? At the moment, we are offshoring the soil damage. You go up to Cadbury Hill and you look at Somerset, there's not a turbine. We're offshoring that to the communities in China that are having to build and do this have been moved off their land into cell blocks. So, what's the answer? And I have to say, it's not easy. It's not easy at all. We have to change our lifestyles. But most of you have already done that. And if the rest of Britain lived my kind of lifestyle, which is pretty yogic, the economy would collapse. There'd be millions of people unemployed. There'd be riots on the streets. So I'm stumped, to be honest. I don't think science has the answer. What I'm working on is how can we be resilient? Because as Ralph pointed out, and anyone who's seen the figures knows, it's a fantasy. It can't work. It's going to collapse. The whole thing is unstable. And so how do we as human beings stabilize ourselves? And we have got to get away from this emergency, fear-based, manipulative world that's trying to do what it's doing. And I'll end on one note because I really feel strongly about this. The American professor showed a graph of carcinogenic damage and distance from a telephone tower, mobile telephone tower. And it didn't get down to normal until you were 500 meters away. In the church, there's a tower. And 50 meters away, there's children playing every single day. So we need a rebellion, and if there's, I know there are members of Extinction Rebellion here. Oh, for God's sake. Get a brain. There is a real ecological and spiritual emergency on this planet. I'm an ecologist, it's real. But climate is not the issue. There is time. There is time. And Extinction Rebellion needs to refocus. We need that energy of the young people, but please, don't fill them with fear.
Bravo!
Thank you very much for listening.
Peter, thank you so very much. That was an amazingly heartfelt presentation, and thank you so much. That was incredible. Wow, people got tears. Right, and now we have the wonderful Ian Jarvis to speak about 5G and EMFs and how they affect nature. And really what we're doing really about it. Anyway, here we go. This is the wonderful Ian Jarvis, who's talking all over the country, being very busy with lots and lots of talks. It's absolutely incredible. Thank you, Ian.
Is that Mike? I lost my clicker. My clicker's on there, is it? It's here. Oh, thanks. Okay, brilliant.
Okay, we should be ready to go. Thank you, Peter.
I could really, in a sense, throw all my notes away and start with what Peter left. Sorry? Okay? I just get my notes. I could throw my notes away and carry on from where Peter left off, because he's right about what he said about the distance that we need to stand away. And I mean, the one thing he didn't say is that there. Can we fix this again? I got dressed up too. Okay.
Point the microphone down because it's a little bit.
Oh, okay. Is that better? Great. Thank you. What he said about that is quite true. There is a distance, and actually, people often say I talk about 5G. I talk about more than 5G. I talk about radio frequencies. That's really what we must remember, that even though it's been a great marketing tool for the industry, 5G, we've still got 2G, 3G, 4G around, and many other things as well that are emitting radio frequencies. We'll come on to it, but I wonder how many people of you have got a doorbell. Yeah, one of those doorbells. How many people have got those new doorbells? That's surveillance. It's breaching GDPR. It's collecting data which is going up to the cloud. You are doing their business for them, and they're just selling your data. So just throw it away. It's amazing how this just creeps in slowly, you know, and the same goes for your car, and the same goes for many other devices around your home. So just be a little bit careful when you buy anything. We can control that. If they want to collect the data, there'll be more data coming from, and useful data coming from, one of those Ring doorbells that are filming you than there will from the cameras on the traffic lights and in a road junction. But let's bring it back to climate. I'll go back to what I thought about talking about, because when I was many years ago, about 5 decades ago maybe, I was told that we'd soon be flooded and all the coastal towns within 10 years would be flooded and the sea would rise and we'd all have to move up inland. Well, as you can see, I've had a few decades since then. If I go back and walk on those beaches where I walked as a young boy, a young man, and look at where the sea is, it's pretty much in the same place, isn't it? Yeah, it's not moved very much. And that's what we're being sold. Now, whatever the problem is, and the previous speakers have put it really well, but whatever the problem is, Peter mentioned some things, Ralph mentioned some things, we're not going to solve it with technology, with accounting practices. You know, the idea of the energy changes that Margaret Thatcher brought in, it was just pure accounting. That's it, the pure accounting. Technology, accounting, design, industrial society. We are not going to create a society that we want, I'm sure most of you are with me. This is what we're going to create if we go down that route. Ericsson is the largest manufacturer of the towers and things that you see around the world at the moment. Those things that are going on. And you notice those words that I've highlighted in red there. That's what they plan to do with you. These are just a few of them in Wolverhampton. You may be luckier than I am in Wolverhampton and not have so many in Glastonbury. Here's another statement. We found this a couple of months ago in a planning application, which is where I do a lot of work, as you'll see later on. A planning application, and you can see those are very words. Again, it's not me telling you this, it's the telecommunication companies themselves. This comment was hidden, I think, on page 29 of that particular application. You can look at the URL there, and you can go and look at it. The last word is the most important one. Yeah? Agenda. So, there is an agenda. Agenda, is that a conspiracy as well? Or is it just an agenda? Who sold us this agenda? Who asked us? Who consulted us for this agenda? Well, we'll come back to that later because there was a few more words after that in that application, and I'll show you them right at the very end when we come to the end of my talk. Probably by a few deviations as well as we go. But the first thing I want to say, I mentioned all those different radiations. We need to remember that the radiation that they're putting out is not a side effect. It is the effect. That's what they're designed to do. Flood the whole area with radiation. Radio frequency radiation. RFR, you see many terms, RFR, Wi-Fi, and many other terms. They're all basically the same thing. And there is a difference, as we see, between 4G and 5G as well. About 30 years ago, we decided that we needed a standard. It's what we do, isn't it? We make standards up. You know, you drive on the left of the road is a pretty good standard. The speed limit in Glastonbury is 200 miles an hour is not a very good standard. And we get a bit of this with this organisation here, the International Commission on Non-Ionising Radiation Protection. And that's the body that set the standard. It was created up around about the mid-90s. First report was issued in 1998, and it still applies actually, because it was a guideline, not a standard. And it still applies. They've updated it several times since then, and the latest version is 2020. So, and there's quite a few problems with it, but I'm not going to go into that tonight, because we've got something else I need to talk about. But that's the first sentence of the introduction to the latest version, created in 2020. There's nothing about the rest of life. It's completely ignored. Did you notice that last word again? Humans. Now, thank you very much, but I think I need other plants and animals to exist. But as a lawyer might say, the 43 or something pages of that paper are silent on animals, fish, birds, insects, and the lot. We're not talking about it. It wouldn't matter if there was another organisation that was going to create a standard or a guideline for that, but there isn't. And there isn't even another committee in the ICNIRP. That's the unpronounceable word that we actually use for ICNIRP. So, no conversations about animals or nature, so we better talk about them tonight. And that's what Sandy asked me to address in the first instance. So, I apologise for this picture. Yes, it's a dead horse. It's not really nature in the way that we know it, but I expect there's a horsey community around here. Yes? No? There's, in this particular race course, the season was stopped the beginning of June, because horses were dying much more frequent, about 8 times more than they had done in any year before. Now, if that happens, what would be the question you would first ask if you were the investigating vet? Well, I'll tell you, this will be mine. What's changed? I'll tell you what's changed. What has changed is that what is being put underneath the saddle of these racehorses this season is the equivalent to a horsey Fitbit. And I expect a lot of you in the room are wearing your Fitbits now. You might take them off after we've discussed this. That horsey Fitbit underneath the saddle is radiating pulses through the horse's body 2,400 times every second. Every second. Now, I'm sure you know that every horse has about 4 legs, and at the bottom of those legs there are hooves. And I don't know what they are in non-race horses, but in these race horses they have aluminium. They will be radiating those 2,400 signals back 4 times over. Of course, the horse has always got a chip in his neck, which every animal these days has. The Fitbit is connected to GPS. It's also passing the data up to the cloud, where it goes and it's being worked on to calculate how that animal is running. Do you think that could have anything to do with it? I mean, I can't say for certain, of course, but Arthur Furstenberg has written to the vet, and she's not even bothered to reply yet. He suggested that she would look at that and see how it, whether that actually applies. But I think it's a good thing to start investigating. And this, in a sense, is the theme. Why is nobody investigating the possibility that this radiation is affecting people? Somebody's doing this, money, yeah, that's of course one thing. So let's go a little bit really wild, and this is with amphibians. David Wake died a couple of years ago, and he noticed that amphibians of all sorts were reducing. They've been reducing since about 1900. They lasted, they lived through eons and eons of centuries, and they've been pretty much the same ever since. They've not changed very much, and they've been around probably since the dinosaurs, if the dinosaurs were ever around at all. That's for some of you. And so what he found when he started looking behind David Wake's reports and work was that a lot of these pristine areas, particularly in America, a lot of these pristine areas for these nature reserves are supposed to be, they're putting these things up there. Towers, probably because these are phone masts, radio masts, and they're emitting radiation, of course. Now this is in a particular reserve, and that could. Do you think that could have anything to do with it? But of course, what they're looking at is climate change. So that brings us back to where we started the evening, I think. Yeah. So, but so far there has not been any scientific research that has made a causation link between the deaths of amphibians and climate change. So wouldn't you think they might be investigating something else as well? Yeah? Let's move on a little bit. This is a pristine area. It's called Pentre Hodr. It's actually in Shropshire. I would have classed it as a Welsh mountain a few weeks ago, but it's actually now an English mountain or an English hill. There's an application in Shropshire Council to put a 4G mast from various tower, actually a big tower with about can't remember the number of antennas on it, up on the top of that hill there, in this pristine area. I've put an objection in. Are we stupid? Are we really stupid? Anyway, this pristine area. Incidentally, if anybody wants to put an objection in, there's still time. You've got until the 11th to put an objection into the Shropshire Council. I put some little pieces of paper on that table over there, and you can contact me and I'll give you the details of how you can can write that in if you want to. But that's what we're doing to our country. Walking area is farmland, as you can see, mostly sheep. It's right next to an ancient wood. That's an ancient wood. There are not many ancient woods around at the moment, so there's untold riches of animals and bugs and insects and all sorts of things. All they talk about is a few birds and badgers in their application. They do actually mention them, to be fair to the applicant, but that's about it. But again, it leads us back to this. This happened in Texel Island on the Netherlands, coastal stream of the Netherlands. It's quite well known, this incident. Birds were suddenly dying. Researchers, scientists, naturalists found dead and dying sandwich terns on this island in the nature reserve. Again, what did they put it down to? Well, they noticed that they put it down to, guess? Bird flu. Of course, straight away, put it down to bird flu. Despite the fact that it was spring, and bird flu does not normally occur in the spring. They also didn't look a little bit further because there are even 2 more reserves of these terns in Netherlands itself. One with no deaths and one with some deaths. The same thing was happening in other colonies around Europe, I think notably in France. I remember reading about it just over a year or so ago. And one of the interesting things is, do you think it could be anything to do with one of these? Well, again, I've spoken to Arthur Furstenberg and we discussed it, and he was researching this for the last year, and he's come up with 4 reasons why these towers can harm creatures, birds in this particular case. The first one is, this is a very busy area, and there's a shipping lane right by the island. So traffic matters because traffic increases the radiation that's being sent over these places. With a shipping lane, you're going to get the ship to shore, ship to ship, and so many things that ships have and communicating. Very busy lane. If it had been a large population of humans, of people, of course the same thing would happen, but there's not. And in fact, in this particular place, one of the other things is that when you suddenly increase the radiation levels to somewhere, it can have a lethal effect. We saw that in the horses. In here, right next to the colony, there had been 18 4G antennas erected in the months just before that happened. So I'm not saying it is the possibility, I'm just saying, let's investigate it. Why are they not investigating this stuff? It's not rocket science, is it? What's changed? Look at it. Interestingly enough, the terns themselves have actually returned to the area, but they've avoided the radiated old colonies and gone to new places for colonies. Now that should tell us a story, and it might be something that we could usefully take note of ourselves. So should I move from Wolverhampton? There was a final thing actually, which I just forgot about, because he's saying that 4G could be worse than 5G in this particular respect. And I just need to divert a little bit. Have you ever dropped stones in a still pond? Yes? And you've seen those circles radiate out and they make nice little ripples, yes? And then if you drop another one in, the ripples come and the ripples bump together and they make a sort of disturbed pattern. Well, that's sort of what happens with the 4G signals. They're coming out in exactly the same way. It's 3-dimensional, of course. I can't do the arm movements because I've got I'm holding a microphone here. But, and when they bump into each other, we really don't know what's happening. And if everybody here's got a mobile phone in their pockets or somewhere, and it's radiating like that. They're all bumping in together, so we're getting lots of little not spots and hot spots, as the techies like to call them. I'm not a techie anymore, really. So that's 4G. And we really don't know what's happening when they all bump into each other. So all the people on the front row here and every other row, every one of you will have a different level of exposure during this evening. Every single one of you, and me as well. We can't calculate. 5G is a bit like getting a radio-controlled motorbike and running it straight through the middle of all that disruption. So it makes beams, and the beams go from the tower to a device. So that's why, whereas the 4G is spreading over the whole area, like the ship from the shipping lane in Texel, whereas this one is, the 5G is aiming at these different people. And I mean, the ultimate use of that will be scanning your body in your home and seeing you. Look at Amazon Sidewalk, everybody. So that's the way it goes. And if we go back into science, not into science really, going back into life on the planet, this, vaguely speaking, is what it might have been like a few millennia ago, although we probably weren't wearing clothes like that. You can see I'm not much of an artist. I like to notice that the alpha brain rhythms and the Schumann resonance, which was calculated late last century, and is the frequency between the Earth and the ionosphere, are pretty much the same. A very little bit, and of course they've got harmonics. I was discussing that with somebody the other day. And then when we invented electricity, around about the late 1800s, we went in, so a couple of hundred years later, this is what we've got. So my question then is, are we being exposed to an excessive and sudden, relatively sudden increase in this radiation? And is it going to affect us? Now, that number of 100,000 satellites, we've not got there yet. When we started a few years ago, there were 2,000 or 3,000. I think it's up to about 50 or 60,000 now. But I was reading something a few days ago which said Rwanda, yes, listen to this, Rwanda is planning to put up 300,000 itself. Now, I'm not sure whether they're going to get the technology or the money for that, but I could make a good guess. So do you think it's possible that that could be having some negative effects on us? Yeah, I think so too. But I want to go back because there's a woman called Diana Cordas, and who's done a wonderful report about insects. She lives on the island of Samos, which is a Greek island, and she noticed that when 4G towers were put on there, the island, it's a fairly pristine island, it's not a big tourist destination, all her neighbours grow organically, there are no big farms on the island, so it's pretty good apart from the towers. And she noticed she and her husband used to do lots of walking around the island, and they noticed they were not seeing the insects. As she points out, it's much more difficult to notice when insects or something disappears than when it suddenly appears. So she's got you can download her paper, Kordas. You'll find her paper relatively easily. And the importance of her work is that 80% of the pollinators are insects. So that's going to affect our agriculture, our gardens. I'm sure lots of, I heard Indra say something about allotments, didn't I, earlier? Yeah, I bet there's lots of people around here with allotments and vegetable gardens and things. So that's really what's important about that, that the pollinators are there. And also, another thing about 4G, it was 4G masts and towers on a place in Australia called Mount Nardi that was put up some years ago, again, a very heavily researched area, and they've noted the biodiversity loss over the years through that, ever since that 4G tower went up. We will be putting up 5G towers. I will talk about 5G a little bit, I promise. But it's important to recognise that it's all the radiation. Let's move on to trees, to plants. Okay. Okay. This is, I don't need to talk about these. I can't remember, Cordelia, a German woman, worked through all this, and she took pictures of the trees before there was a tower erected and after. And this study has been going on for about 15 years. I don't even need to mention it. You can see the effects. This is a young linden tree. If it's affecting us, if we get personal and it's thinking about affecting us, we're not going to go into the health tonight. There's just not enough time. But I've just been told I've only got 5 minutes left. So you can see we've got, 10, okay, thank you. I thought it sounded it had gone a bit quick. So you see the difference in the exposure of a child's head. This picture's from E.H. Trust, Deborah Davies, good researcher, and I'm not going to say what the effects are because we've not got time, but if we think about that scenario that I explained a little bit earlier, think of it in a schoolroom. Children are sitting there, 5 hours a day, 5 days a week, 10 years. What's it doing for them? Well, the answer is I don't know. I don't know precisely. I can make suspicions and guesses, but I don't actually K-N-O-W in capitals. But the government doesn't seem to worry about it at all. Matt Warman, who was a digital czar or whatever they called him in the day, wrote this. Notice those 2 red words that I've highlighted. That tells me there is evidence and there is concern. We need to be very, very careful, very pedantic when we read papers like that, because they can tell us an awful lot just by those words like that. And the same goes to planning applications. I'm going to skip a little bit because we've only got a little time. I promised that I would show you this slide at the end. This is what came after those words in that slide. And apart from noticing the agenda bit, the centralised control, notice the second sentence there. 5G is just the basic. Just the basic. Okay, so what's coming next? 6G, yeah, you've all heard of that. 7G, goodness knows how many Gs will be. G stands for generation, by the way. It's not gigahertz, not to be confused with that, which is big G, big H, and a little Z. It can be confusing because sometimes people don't use the right abbreviation for it. Yeah, this is the more basic technology. Have you heard of a smart region? I hadn't heard of it until I saw that. What's a smart region? But you'll notice, without 5G, they can't do it. This is basically an admission that without 5G we can't do it. And this is why I've been doing so much work in the last 2 or 3 years to stop the rollout of these 5G masts via the planning, mostly via the planning sites, applications. And of course at the bottom there you notice they have to bring in climate change. So yet again, climate change is fundamental to their agenda. Can I use that word now? Yeah. And I think even in this slide itself, I can see the link between climate change, net zero, 5G, LTNs, smart city, smart region. You can see it all growing up, can't you? And what's even more important, 2 things I want to make. Anybody read about absolute zero? Absolute zero. What do you think of that, Peter? Ralph? Absolute zero. There's a paper by 5 universities, I think, FIRES it's called, FIRES, Have a look at that on the website. Absolute zero is the new net zero is old hat. Absolute zero is the one. But one of the really important things, coming back to things that I think it was Ralph said earlier, the amount of electricity that a 5G mast uses compared to a 4G mast is about 3 times. It's about the equivalent, some calculations have done. I personally have not done the calculation, but others have. And it's about equivalent to 40 houses, 40 average domestic houses. Yeah? And once we get all those smart things, like the Internet of Things, the Internet of Bodies, the Internet of Eyes, the Internet of all these different things, it's going to double in power needed. So the amount of power that we are going to need, in addition to what Ralph was illustrating, is going to be enormous. You know, my hope is that we'll just have major blackouts around the country, and then we won't have a smart city at all, will we? I'm going to roll off simply by saying that we can do something about this. We can stop buying those devices I mentioned in the first place, and we can also approach it by planning. I go around the country doing talks. I talk anywhere. You just have to ask me, and I'll come anywhere. So far, I think the furthest south has been Totnes, Worthing in the east, and Aberdeen in the north. So I want to fill in the gaps. So if you want to see how you can actually start doing something positive by taking action and preventing this. The record so far is a friend of mine was doing a count in Birmingham, and she said that about 75% of their masts in Birmingham have been refused. That's good. I have a friend who's in planning and development, and he did a search for me, and the overall figure is about just under 50% of being refused. That's still pretty good. With all these holes around, they won't be able to bring in this smart city agenda. So this is my final comment. Just be more afraid of what will happen if you don't do it than you are of doing it. And that's a good night from me.
Thank you so much, Ian. That's amazing. Lots of really interesting facts there. And now, oh, it's me. Okay. I've got some. Right, I don't know, how long have I got? 20 minutes, brilliant. I just really wanted to kind of consolidate this with, I mean, we've seen all the climate information and the 5G, and it's like joining the dots
because we've got so much stuff being thrown at us, different agendas being thrown at us, and sometimes it's really important to join the dots of these agendas. And the overriding agenda is Agenda 21, Agenda 2030. I mean, 2030 was just a goal. It was put in place in 2015 after the Earth Summit really gave birth to Agenda 21 in 1992. But the agenda was going on a lot before then, since really the mid-1970s. So we're talking about a very long-term agenda. And they call it Agenda 21. It is an agenda. And it was a major shift in social engineering that happened in 1992. And really what I noticed when I first started really going into this, down this rabbit hole, because I'd been working for the corporates for many years, and I began to see what was happening, and I came out of the corporate world, and I've made this my mission for what it's worth for the last 16 years, to try and raise awareness about Agenda 21. And it's only now that it's being recognised as, 2030 is really pushing forward. It's being accelerated by the United Nations, by the WEF, by the WHO, and we're finding ourselves, marching towards this dystopian future that none of us want. We didn't ask for it, we don't want it. So I'm really going to take you on a very, very quick 20-minute romp on the history of Agenda 21, 2030, and how we got here, because it's really important to know where we're going, to know how we've got here at this point, and how we need to reverse it, what we have to do to reverse this damage that's been done. Basically, United Nations Agenda 21, it's a 42-chapter document published by the United Nations, and it was really launched in 1992 at the Earth Summit. Now, the Earth Summit was held in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. It's also called Sustainable Development. It was written as this 42-chapter document. On the face of it, it talks about sustainability, environmentalism, and conservation, but at its heart, it seeks to divide man from nature and control all of the resources, taking control of land, sea, minerals, and just about everything on our planet, under the deception of changing the world and saving the world. The precursors, there were three major Club of Rome reports that really made the bones of Agenda 21. And these went right back to the 1970s. And these Club of Rome reports, because the Club of Rome was really the think tank for the United Nations at the time. And so we had, let me just do this. Oh, here we go. The first one was Limits to Growth in 1972, and this was all about population, overpopulation and depopulation. And it was put together sort of at a time when population was really a big thing. It was about the exponential economic and population growth with finite supply of resources, studied by it was mainly computer simulation. And unfortunately, a lot of these Club of Rome reports were really based on computer simulations. And we know where that goes. I mean, they're not accurate. And they made wild presumptions about what the population would be and how much we would actually not have enough resources to go around. Even by 1980, 1990, we're talking 1972 at the time. And there was a guy called Paul Ehrlich who wrote The Population Bomb in the 1970s at the same time. It was a big sort of Malthusian sort of kind of ideology at the time that was going around about there's not enough resources, we've got to cull the population, or we've got to bring in sort of family planning and all sorts of ways of not having so many people on the planet. And this kind of persisted for quite a long time, and a lot of people got on board with this. And it was really in the 1970s that the technocracy movement of the 1930s was reborn by Zbigniew Brzezinski. He was a big mover and shaker in the Trilateral Commission, you know, the Council for Foreign Relations, you know, the Bilderberg Group, and he wrote a book in the 1990s called Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technocratic Era. And it really was all about bringing technocracy into the modern age, because they tried it in the 1930s, it didn't work, it failed. It came out of Columbia University, and it really failed because they didn't have the technology and the Second World War kicked in. It was around the 1930s that they, you know, from Columbia University, there was a guy called Howard Scott and a guy called M.K. Hubbard. And Hubbard was the man who had the peak oil principle, if you understand all that. And Hubbard and M.K. Scott, along with Joshua Haldeman, who was Elon Musk's grandfather, they came up with this idea that we could actually have an energy-based economy instead of a price-based economy. They'd had all the depression of the 1930s, and they were fed up with politicians and bankers, as we are now. And it's very similar time, actually, that they were fed up with all of them. They decided to try and create an energy-based economy instead of a price-based economy. But it kind of fell flat on its face. They didn't have the wherewithal to do it, they didn't have the technology, but now they do. So that's really how it became reinvented in the 1970s, this ideology of being able to use carbon credits, and all of that was being seeded around 1970s. Now, in 1987, another Club of Rome report was brought about. It's called the Brundtland Commission report. And that really was another part of Agenda 21, and it was about making countries more equitable. We were known at that point as the polluting West. We were the bad guys. And this was almost like a second Marshall Plan. It was about shifting money across to India and China, because they were the poor people. And we need to be equitable, we need to be fair in the world. And it sounded like sort of, you know, it sounded okay. And the Brundtland Commission, she was Gro Harlem Brundtland, I think she was the Prime Minister of Norway at the time, very socialist lady, and she was groomed by Maurice Strong at the United Nations to write the Brundtland Commission and to come up with this plan to actually shift a lot of cash from Europe over to India and China. Now, that's what happened, you know, and this is why, you know, Dr. Shiva was talking about the whole IPCC thing, is that at that time, our industry shifted over to India and China. We stopped producing stuff. It all went over there, and they became the polluters. And yet we were paying the reparations for being the big polluters. So the whole thing was out of whack, and it was meant to be. This is a plan to deindustrialize the West, to create, if you like, a kind of, if you know, we just got deindustrialized. We didn't produce anything, and so a lot of our manufacturing shifted over to other countries, and it also happened, you know, a lot went over to Germany and France, but particularly India and China. So that whole sort of East-West thing began then, where the East rose and we went down in our manufacturing. So that was really what our common future was about. It's very commutarian. Sort of, I mean, if you understand what commutarianism is, it's a kind of corporate communism, and that's really what our common future was about. And it was based on sustainable development, and this was how they were going to make the world sustainable. Let's make everything equitable. Let's shift it all over to India and China, which of course, you know, hasn't worked, as we know. Now, the first global revolution was the third one, literally just before the Earth Summit. In 1992, the Club of Rome published this think tank document, and it's called The First Global Revolution, and I have a very tatty copy of it here. Now, this was interesting because this is really where climate change was born. if you like. And I'm just going to read from, just very quickly, a section from it, because this is quite interesting. This was all about creating, identifying enemies, because if you think at this time, the First and Second World Wars were over, and the Berlin Wall had just come down in '89. So we had this lack of enemies, really, and we need enemies, don't we? And guess who became the enemy? On page, which one's this, 108, it says, the need for enemies seems to be a common historical factor. States have striven to overcome domestic failure and internal contradictions by designating external enemies. The scapegoat practice is as old as mankind itself. When things become too difficult at home, divert attention by adventure abroad. Bring the divided nation together to face an outside enemy, either a real one or one invented for the purpose. With the disappearance of the traditional enemy, the temptation is to designate a scapegoat, or religious or ethnic minorities whose differences are disturbing. Now, on page 115, they identify that enemy. It's page 115 of the First Global Revolution, which was written as the think tank document by the Club of Rome for the United Nations to create Agenda 21. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. In their totality and in their interactions, these phenomena do constitute a common threat which demands the solidarity of all people. But in designating them as the enemy, we fall into the trap about which we've already warned. All these dangers are caused by human intervention, and it is only through changed attitudes and behaviour that they can be overcome. The real enemy, then, is humanity itself. So we became the enemy in 1991 when they published the First Global Revolution. We were identified as the enemy of humanity because that was the only enemy they could find. We are the scapegoat, as they spoke. So unfortunately, it's a crisis think tank. The Club of Rome is a crisis think tank, and we still have crisis think tanks. You know, this is still going on within the United Nations and the WEF, and they cook up all sorts of scenarios for us. Now, this is Maurice Strong. He was the Secretary General of the United Nations in 1992, and he was the man who was the grandfather of Agenda 21. And one of the quotes he said at the Earth Summit, and this is a really telling quote, he said, "The effective execution of Agenda 21 will require a profound re-engineering of all human society, unlike anything the world has ever experienced. A major shift in the priorities of both governments and individuals, and an unprecedented redeployment of human and financial resources. This shift will demand that a concern for the environmental consequences of every human action will be integrated into individual and collective decision-making at every level." Now, that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing the consequences for every human action that they've dreamt up from identifying us as the enemy. And, you know, all of this, as we know that CO2 isn't a problem, but all of this was pushed at the Earth Summit. And this is how they got 178 countries at the Earth Summit, the leaders of those countries, to sign up to Agenda 21. At the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992, they said they guilt-tripped 178 leaders of countries And there was a lot of lobbying going on. They had 20,000 green lobbyists there. They had all the heads of state there who they literally lobbied and said, look, if you don't sign this, you won't be saving the planet. And it was, what's interesting is that if you really knew about Maurice Strong and Al Gore and all the people that were at the Earth Summit, I mean, it was the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, Al Gore, a lot of industrialists. It was all about billionaires getting together and working out how they could literally take over the world. And nobody would know. It was all about saving the planet. It was all about environmentalism. And it wasn't. It was a big, fat lie. And that's what we've been living with ever since. Now, just a little bit about Maurice Strong. He says, you know, we may get to the point where the only way of saving the world will be for industrial civilization to collapse. He actually said after that, isn't it our duty to make this happen? Isn't it our duty to make this civilization collapse? And that's what they want. They want societal collapse. And actually, he was he headed up the Earth Summit. It was often called the Unsaid Conference, the UNCED conference. He was a member of the Club of Rome, the Trilateral Commission, Council for Foreign Relations, and he was a member of the Fabian Society. He was a self-confessed communist in ideology and a capitalist in methodology. I mean, that kind of really is communitarianism. If you're a capitalist in methodology and a communist in ideology, that is communitarianism, because it's corporate communism. And that's what we're living under right now. Anyway, he was exiled to China to avoid prison in the oil for food scandal in 1995, where the UN Security Council made a resolution to supply Iraq with food in exchange for oil, where there were revelations of corruption of funds involving Maurice Strong, Adnan Khashoggi, and many other oil billionaires. He loved China. His sister actually lived with Mao Zedong. His cousin lived with Mao Zedong, and he ended his days in China. He loved the Chinese social system, social credit system. He loved the way the Chinese were, because they were compliant, and he could see that as a model for the rest of the world, so that they could be in charge. And he worked for the Rockefellers and for many years in their finances. He worked for the Rockefellers for 17 years. So this man is deeply corrupt, and he was the one that really gave birth to Agenda 21 in 1992. During one of the things that was born out of the Earth Summit was ICLEI, the International Committee for Local and Environmental Initiatives. It was set up to implement Agenda 21 right down from the global to the local. And that is why ICLEI is in every town council in our country and in the world, actually. And it's there to really put these agendas through, climate change agendas, so that we actually end up with the final countdown is for everyone to be under control of global governance. And that's the end game. And I'll go into that in a minute. Obviously, this is not what we'll, we will battle this one. This won't happen. Now, there's a lot of ways that it comes into our communities, and these are some of the NGOs that actually work, and I'm sure some of you will recognise some of them. There's, Unlimited, Locality, Community Organisers, Power to Change, People Power. I mean, I've seen some of these NGOs locally, and they've come in as what they call agents of change. These are trained NGOs that come into local communities to literally push this agenda, to push the climate change agenda, so that we all get on board with it. And this is how our communities have been taken over. And it's this mantra of climate change, net zero, climate emergency. This is how they did it. They've just infiltrated everywhere. And we didn't ask for any of this, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was again something that came out of the Earth Summit. Now, this was a body, literally, as we know, paid consultants to, and they're being paid heavily to churn out misinformation on climate. And this is, unfortunately, what we've been dealing with for many, many years. And you'll find that most of the climate scientists that come out and tell the truth are retired. And there's a reason for that, because when they're young, they've got families to feed, and if they don't go along with the narrative, their funding is taken away. And so this is 5 minutes, thank you. So we've got the IPCC, the 3 E's of sustainable development: social equity, economic prosperity, ecological integrity. And when did it become 2030? It became 2030 in 2015, when the Pope endorsed the 17 goals of Agenda 2030. And what happened was, prior to that, it had been the Millennium Goals, which hadn't been achieved. They've not achieved a lot of their goals. Basically, this really brought the Catholic Church, effectively making the Catholic Church the UN's servant on earth. And, you know, talking about the last 3 years, you know, the soul theft of what's happening now with what happened in the last 3 years with the pandemic. And you realise that was an acceleration, that was a deliberate acceleration of the 17 goals. Because in 2019, in June, Antonio Guterres of the United Nations met with Klaus Schwab in Geneva, and they set up this meeting, and it's the Strategic Framework Partnership Forum, to accelerate the 17 goals. And then 4 months later, hey presto, we have Event 201, and they add Bill and Melinda Gates into the mix to come up with a tabletop scenario. In Brazil, a wet market in Brazil, a virus breaks out. What do we do about it? Oh, Bill and Melinda Gates are there. Yeah, we've got a vaccine. And that was a 3-day tabletop scenario. A what if there was a pandemic of coronavirus? And then it really happened. So was that just coincidence? I don't think so. And what does Agenda 21 seek to achieve? Top-down global governance, populations moved into concentrated urban areas called smart cities or human settlement zones near train lines, no cars or air travel, every human action surveilled and carbon taxed, concentration of wealth and power to the surveillance state, surveillance capitalism, and cashless society. And then we've got the Absolute Zero document, which, you know, I know Indra said that they don't take it seriously. This was debated in the House of Lords. It was given, it's in Hansard, it was given priority to be implemented. And, you know, it says there, no planes or ships out of UK after 2029. No gas boilers, no wood burners. This is definitely something that needs to be taken seriously. Net zero is zero your carbon, you know, and this is kind of what they want. They don't want us. It's almost like a death cult. It's like, you know, shrinking our world down so much that we can't move. We're restricted in movement, and really the idea, the end game, is to have everybody experiencing life through a virtual reality headset in a smart city apartment, so that you don't go anywhere. You don't do anything, and your soul is almost kind of taken away from your body, and you live your life in an alternative reality in the metaverse. This is the end game of what they want. It won't happen. There's not much uptake in the metaverse. I know we've got payment systems in the metaverse, MasterCard and Visa. You can buy real estate in the metaverse, and this is what they're doing. They're twinning everything in this world to create an alternative reality, and it's hideous. And there's other things I could go into, like we've got the environmental and social governance system coming in very, very soon. This will happen after the COP conference, into our businesses, and really we'll be restricted. Our businesses will literally have to comply to the most extraordinary draconian measures for environmental, social, governance. And so it's almost like a tax on your business. And this needs to be looked at. I can't seem to move the thingy forward, but anyway, it won't go any further. So it looks like we've sort of coming to a natural end. But I just wanted to say that this whole thing is really, it's anti-human, it's anti-nature. And it really is a way of restricting the human being and controlling the human being. And we are worth so much more than that. We are free, creative, fabulous human beings. And global governance is really wanting to crush that creativity and that kind of, if you like, the link with nature and creator and everything that we hold dear. We have to hang on to that. And we must, you know, what's going on in our schools, the children are very confused about what is real. We have something called reality privilege coming in, where people just don't, you know, the elites are allowed to know what is real, but our children are confused about their gender, about everything that's going on in the world. What is real, what isn't? What is fake news, what isn't? And it's about time we actually got down to common sense and understood that our children need guidelines, they need to know what's real, they need to know what nature is, they need to know what sex they are. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you so much for coming and participating, and it's been great. We're going to have Q&A now. Thank you. Just a quick thank you. Leela. Where's Leela? Leela May. Thank you so much. What a blooming Trojan you are. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. And I want to say thank you to all the other people that have come from a long way who are battling their own town councils. Colchester. I don't know if Thetford, Winchester. All these people, I can't remember who else, but loads of people. We need to keep this conversation going. Thank you. And challenge your town councils, challenge net zero, challenge your climate emergencies. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Are you ready? Go on, go for it. So who's got any questions? That's the question.
Right, I know Ian has a question. Does anyone else have a question? Okay. Yeah. Right, maybe we should sit you up there. Yes. If all of you go up there.
Gary's got some really good stuff to say.
Huh?
Gary's got some really good
stuff.
Oh,
great. Okay, lovely.
Sandy.
Yeah.
This is more of a statement for people who don't just than a question. You know, I've got a lot to say myself as other times as well. Stop controlling it. Stop controlling it. I've asked people in to that's all. I've got a statement from a Christine Anderson. This went viral recently. She's a Euro MEP. She works for Alternative Germany. What she said. Now, I had a lot more to come up. We wrote this quote here, but obviously I'm not going to have the chance to say these, right? So, this is what she said, and I'll quote, "I'm really imploring the people and all the peoples around the world, for God's sake, stop giving those democratically elected governments the benefit of the doubt. They are not deserving of that. They are not. Stop rationalising whatever your government is doing. Stop rationalising and coming up with some good intentions. They have no good intentions. Never, as I said before, never in the entire history of mankind, there has never been a political elite concerned about the well-being of regular people. and it isn't any different now. Why should it be? Stop giving them the benefit of the doubt. Because I can tell you, you cannot comply your way out of a tyranny. And this is worldwide. It is impossible. Trying to do so, you will only feed a gigantic alligator in the hopes of being eaten last. But guess what? Your turn will come, and then you will be the one swallowed.
Do you have a question?
I'm almost finished. Bear with us. I also have to ask the people, end your silence, speak up. For God's sake, stop complying, start rebelling. They're out to get you if you do not resist.
I do hate 15-minute questions. Thank you.
You're a country.
Okay, can you pass it across to someone else now?
Thank you, Dad.
I don't have the microphone, he does.
You've got your heads up your own arses.
This sort of relates to what was said, but it is a question. Why are governments, councils, are being referred to as de jure lawful organisations? They are privately owned. HM government is the trading name on USEC for Her Majesty's government, or His Majesty's government. Also the corporation. They're all corporations, they have no interest in public interest, there is no public, so why are they referring to as de jure public authorities? They're fraudulent, treasonous criminals, that's what they are.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Free. That wasn't a question.
I don't think that was a question. What is the question?
What's the question?
Why are governments being referred to as de jure authorities?
I can't answer that. That's not a question.
All right. Okay. I think
Ask something rational.
I can answer that question. It's because people don't know that fact.
Ralph's got a mic. Sandy.
Oh,
That's what I'm
Ralph's
saying.
got the mic. Okay.
I totally agree with you. Yeah, I mean the trouble is that our representation of government, our representative government, is being taken over by corporations through public-private partnerships. And no, this is it. We don't have any government at all. I mean, the thing is, it's the WEF and the United Nations running the show. People talk about the Tories and the Labour. This is all a fallacy. It's a uni-government. That's all we have. One government. Because that's what they want. They want one government, global governance. And so there's no such thing as party politics anymore. It's gone. It's corruption. And that's what we have.
How many people here and how many people on the panel are aware that geoengineering has been going on for decades? And I would refer people to look at Exmoor back in the 1950s when 2 villages were wiped out, practically Linton and Lynmouth. The RAF admitted some years later to going up and cloud seeding, didn't think it worked and went up and did it again, and the result was devastation. 38 people died. One woman had to identify her mother's body by a birthmark on her back because she was missing her head and limbs. So, you know, our skies have been manipulated for a long time, our weather has been changed for a long time. So what evidence have we got that that is still going on now, and what can we do about it?
As an airline captain for 40 years, I can tell you that's not happening in the commercial world. It simply doesn't. Aircraft have been contrailing for the last 50, 70 years, ever since the Second World War, when they could get up above 25,000 feet. That is a little bit of a fallacy. There is the policy of cloud seeding, which they use in China, but is not being used here. So I think that is a little bit of an exaggeration. Would you like to add anything?
There have been geoengineering experiments, particularly in Russia, and intriguing because they were carried out by a Professor Yuri Israel, who was a geoscientist, and he used to be vice chairman of the IPCC in 2001. And he was interviewed, asked the Vice Chairman by the media, and said, and what do you make of all this, you know, the climate crisis and so on, what's your take in Russia? And he said, well, actually, all our scientists in the academy think that it's just a natural cycle, and it's really hyped. He didn't believe in the whole carbon monster in 2001. In 2004, Putin signed the Kyoto Protocol, and Russia received vast billions of dollars of carbon credits. And so Israel was commissioned to cool the planet, and he flew aeroplanes and distributed barium sulfate into the stratosphere, which is what happens when you have a volcano. It takes a long time to come out, and it reflects the sun's rays. And that was published. It was published in the Russian Journal of Meteorology and Hydrology about 3 years later. That's the only published experiment, and basically they said it's not going to work. And our own government's commission on the issue came to the same conclusion. Their idea of geoengineering is to bury the carbon underground, somehow suck it out of the air. So in terms of academia and official government, there isn't. But observant people, especially where my family come from in West Wales, they have shown me photographs of crisscross patterns. And that's not on any commercial, what do you call it, air traffic.
No, the crisscross patterns are caused by the upper jet streams. So you get aircraft flying on airways, and the wind drifts their contrails to one side, and it forms a crisscross. Going back to, I think, the more problematic point that Peter was mentioning here was the carbon capture and sequestration. The trouble is, there are a few plants. They're quite expensive. They don't work very well. But they are putting liquid CO2 into geological formations down below. Nobody has explained how they can stop a CO2 blowout, a well blowout. So if they have a well blowout of CO2, you've got CO2 now running down the countryside. Now, they had this in Lake Nyos, if you remember, in Africa. They had a CO2 blowout from a lake, and the CO2 ran down the valley, and it killed 2,000 people. Nobody has explained how these carbon capture projects can prevent a CO2 well blowout. If we have a well blowout in the North Sea, that CO2 will drift around to our east coast, to the Dutch coast, and kill everybody on the coastlines. That's not being addressed.
Yeah, just to add a little note about.
Okay, I wanted to make a comment on the last one, really. You dismissed chemtrails really at a stroke. And I see those chemtrails all the time. I never saw those chemtrails as a child. They are not the same as chemtrails. And the other thing I wanted to say was, I remember hearing on Radio 4 about Lynmouth and King's Lynn and the cloud seeding of the rain, and it was Lynmouth, where the mountain fell down on the children, on the school. I'm sorry.
Yeah, with the contrailing, since you asked that. Yeah, I can't answer too many questions. Okay. With the contrailing, as an airline captain, I have to know every nut and bolt on the aircraft. I can assure you that no civil aircraft has a separate tank for contrailing. It simply does not exist. Yeah, but we don't have a military anymore. We've got about 100 aircraft, and that's about it. Within the civil world, there is no such thing. There is contrailing, which is the CO2 and the water vapor that comes out the back of the engine. Now, that does have an effect on climate. It reduces temperatures during the day. and it increases temperatures at night. They proved that during COVID, when, of course, most of aviation was stuck on the ground. So it does have an effect on climate, but that's just the natural fuel being burnt in the engines, nothing special. Some questions down the back.
Okay, I'd like to ask Peter, I'd like to ask you a question about your book. A couple of questions, actually. One is, you say in your book that the carbon dioxide lags behind the temperature at 800 years. 800. You said, I've read it. It's the carbon dioxide lags the temperature by 800 years. I'd like you to explain that, and please.
Yeah.
And the other thing was, you mentioned about cycles, like the 11-year sun cycle, the ocean, the El Nino Southern Oscillation, for example, as a cycle of 4 years or 5 years. How do you see these cycles mitigating or ameliorating the temperature thing?
Yeah.
Or you know, thank you.
Okay. I work with another scientist in the United States, and we ran a small institute for many years, which we're just winding it up. And we produced several papers on this issue. Basically, the carbon dioxide in the historical record, in the paleo record, is released from the ocean when the ocean's warm. So the ocean's warm first, and then they start to release carbon dioxide. So what's happening? Somehow, and the mechanism is not fully understood, the deep water from the ocean, which has got a lot of carbon dioxide in it, starts to move and comes up. And that creates a whole circulation, a conveyor belt. And once that starts to happen, the temperature of the planet rises, and we come out of an ice age. Now, when we come out, usually it's about 10,000 years before it starts to drop again. And as Ralph pointed out, it drops even though the carbon dioxide level is high. It goes from 180 to 280 regularly with that. And there's a delay from when the temperature starts to rise to when the carbon dioxide starts to rise. So the carbon dioxide is not causing the temperature rise. It may amplify it a little bit, I don't think by much. So this whole process is very complicated. And if you're interested in the science, I can give you, we've got 4 or 5 papers on it. And that they are having impact. They're not being ignored. And then in terms of the future, this warm period that we're in, which is on time, it's a 1,000-year cycle. 1,000 years ago, white stork were nesting on Edinburgh Cathedral. They're only just now moving into Kent. So it's like everything is on time. So that warm period could last a bit longer, 200 or 300 years. I don't think it will. Then it's going to start going down into a little ice age, and then eventually in steps down to a full ice age. That takes about 3,000 years. And then we're in trouble, you know. And if carbon dioxide has any power at all, and it has a little bit of power, it might help stave off the ice age, but don't tell Greenpeace.
Just a quick update on these cycles. Do remember that the Holocene maximum, which is only 8,000 years ago, was 2 degrees warmer than now, and the biosphere was fine. That was mainly caused by Earth's obliquity. Now we know it was 2 degrees warmer because if you look at the taiga forest in northern Russia, it was 200 kilometers further north than now, indicating that the world temperatures were much warmer in the past, and the biosphere was fine. These are cycles, as you've said.
Peter, on that, just a rider on that Holocene optimum 8,000 years ago when Britain was just being populated, the Arctic sea ice melted completely. every year for about 2,000 years, that whole hot, warm period. Polar bears were fine. It's not a tipping point, which somehow that's been blown up. So,
yeah, it was a question to Ralph Ellis. You showed the Arctic ice extent, and it had been going down on the satellite record from 1979. I noticed during lockdown, when there was no activity from mankind, it was 12.2 million kilometres, the Arctic ice extent. As of June, just finished, it was 660,000 kilometres greater.
Yeah,
so
well, that's quite possible. That's quite possible.
There was no, they said there would be rapid melt once it got more and more, because of the white snow wouldn't reflect the sun. Well, the complete opposite to what the scientists said has happened, and the Arctic sea extent has grown in 3 years.
Yeah, CO2 is continuing to rise, but Arctic sea ice has recovered slightly. It's not fully understood why the Arctic is melting and the Antarctic is growing. I have an inkling that it's to do with those pictures I showed about the albedo of the Arctic, the amount of dust on it. My Ice Age paper that I wrote says that the Ice Ages only ended because they got dust on them. Therefore they were darkened, they could absorb more energy, therefore they melted. And it so happens that in the data record we have, every interglacial is preceded by 10,000 years of dust. So there is a correlation between dust and warmth, and it's the dust on the ice sheets that causes the global warming. So it could be, this is by no means proven at all, it could be that Chinese industrial dust on the ice sheets has caused some of the warming that we've experienced over the last 20-30 years. But, you know, that's just a hypothesis.
Anybody else? Anybody else?
Yeah, I would really like to ask, go back to the geoengineering part, because, you know, many of us here know 1,000% that chemtrails and contrails are different. And we've had useful blue skies, but we haven't had many. But also going to the geoengineering part of emission-directed weaponry that's been used to also make it look as if there's heating happening in the planet. I have friends that live in LA. Every year I used to go to LA, and there were certain types of forest fire which weren't actually burning the trees, but they were completely destroying the houses within 20 minutes. So I just wanted to ask you particularly, because you seem to be quite clear that
Well, I know, because I've been in the industry for 40 years. I can tell you that every kilo of equipment on the aircraft, including liquids, has to be included in the manifest for weight and balance. No aircraft carries extra fluids or extra equipment that the pilots and engineers will not know about. On the checkout of the aircraft, I have to check every part of the aircraft. I know every component on the aircraft. There is no spraying equipment on any commercial aircraft. We're pilots, we're professionals. We're pilots, we're professionals. We all go to a certain standard. We're all controlled by aviation authorities. There is no aircraft in this world, civil aircraft, that has spraying equipment on it. I can guarantee you that 100%.
First of all, thank you to these 4 intrepid warriors of madness for their willingness to step beyond the beyond. And my question is one of semantics, linguistics, and asking all those, but primarily these 4 remarkable examples of what learning looks like. Please, can it be possible for an integration of what I have learned as a psychotherapist as a language of responsibility in the manifest propagation of these concepts, these ideas, these realities, these facts. So to move beyond, please can you practice, as I have practiced over the last 35 years of my life, to use the word I, the word me, and the word mine, and resist the temptation to use the word they, them, us, and we, for they are terminologies that are massively counterproductive and very much fear and division inducing. Thank you. That was the question.
I agree. Thank you. I'm not going to make a speech. I just want to ask a brief question. And I would like briefly to acknowledge the fact that these two gentlemen here in particular have given me food for thought this evening. I didn't expect to agree with anything, so I've been quite impressed. But my question is there anybody on the panel or in this hall who thinks that in a world of finite resources we can have indefinite growth in population and consumption?
Yeah, that is a problem. That's why we have to look for multiple sources of energy. Energy is essential for our technological civilizations if we want to maintain our wealth and our prosperity. And so we have to keep looking for more and more viable energy in order to sustain our civilizations. We use an awful lot of energy, and intermittent renewables are not going to cut it. We're going to have something else. But I believe we can still, I hate this idea that we have to regress and go back to mud huts. I was brought up in an era of 2001: A Space Odyssey, when we were going to go to the planets and to the stars. I still want that vision. I'm with Elon Musk on this, that we must push forward. But in order to do so, we need lots of energy if we want to go out into the solar system. I think that is a bold, grand idea, and I see no reason that we should go back to mud huts.
If I could add a rider to that, given that we're both highly educated, I totally disagree. We've only got to go back a few hundred years to see the most incredible art, architecture. You know, if you look around today with all the energy we've got and all the money we've got and what we're creating, you know, it's like, yeah. So, I wouldn't give this lot free energy, frankly. I think we're in for a bit of a decline and a cold time ahead, and we'll learn the lessons that Mother Nature gives us. Yeah, sorry.
I'm afraid that some people will always want power. Pigs will always become men, and it's very difficult to stop that. We have to curtail it. That's why we invented democracy, in order to curtail that, so we didn't get the tyrants. Oh, I know what you're saying, but the ideal of democracy, in order to prevent tyrants coming about. It's not perfect,
but it's better than most systems. I don't know a better system. I don't know. I think I'm not with Ralph about Elon Musk. He can go to Mars. I don't mind that. I would come back to what Willow said, and that is no they, and we can't blame the system because we created it. All of us. There's only one human being here, and we have created this mess. And we have, it's not going to be easy, but the answer will lie in changing ourselves. That's what I feel. What I buy, I don't buy much.
Hello, I've got a question for Ian. I live about 50 yards away from a Tesco store, which is a Wi-Fi hotspot, and they've just added some EV pods, and it's facing my bedroom window. I've started to suffer with palpitations and all sorts of other nausea and all sorts of things. Do I need to move?
Probably. The most important thing you can do is record what happens to you in your health. So when it started, if you can go and see a doctor, if you're still with a doctor, or somebody that can say what your health was earlier, and when the change happens, and what happens at different times as you go along. That's good because it's giving you evidence. There are one or two that have been taken down. It's not as easy as objecting to them in the first place, hence the mention of Pentrahydra earlier. But it is possible. Have you got a light, an LED, outside your window?
There's a load of them all the way around the Tesco car park.
Because they're very
shining into my bedroom. Actually.
Yeah, and they're very harmful as well.
I know.
They use a particular.
What about the EV pods? Are they relevant?
The what?
The EV electric pods for cars.
Oh, the
Charging
car.
points?
Yeah, no, they're all. It all adds up. I mean, that's the thing. If you can do something like, you could try getting a canopy for your bed. You know, from one of the companies that sell that sort of thing. That could help. You can also try earthing. There are companies that do that. Grandology is one I use. And those are the things. But ultimately, Professor Belpalme, who's a professor in Paris University, done a lot of work on this sort of thing. And he offers some remedies, but as he himself says, it's not a cure. There's no cure for radiation sickness other than getting away from it. So at the end of, ultimately, we have to get rid of it all. We need, the only thing we want zero in this world is Wi-Fi. Yeah.
I just wanted to make a suggestion regarding energy use, and I heard somebody mention Tesla, and that made me think also about, obviously Tesla towers, atmospheric electricity, but also like John Searle used to live around here, and he died at age 90 or something like that, and he had a free energy device using magnets. So I'm sure that these technologies do exist, and we don't need any of this nuclear power, or, you know, a lot of these things we've been talking about.
I just wanted to quickly say, going back to the money system, that in my view, decentralized money systems are the way forward. We have to decentralize, get away from centralized money. How we do that don't ask me. Other people will probably know. And I think to get rid of usury is probably the most fundamental thing.
Ian?
Usury. Interest, yeah. Usury. Yeah, interest. That's what kills people, you know. That's what kills economies, it kills everything. Yeah.
Can I just respond to this?
Can I?
Can I suggest that you speak to all of your neighbours and speak to all of the people in your locality? Because the one thing that is going to change everything that's been discussed here tonight that's going in the wrong direction is community. Actually looking each other in the eye and saying hello. My name's Willow. I don't know what your name is, but I'm really glad to see you tonight. And I hope you find a solution. But it's like human beings were the creators of all of these problems, like Peter said. And the answer, permaculture 101, the solution to any problem sits within the problem itself. And as this amazing woman who's done her reading pointed out, humans, we are the enemy. There's no two ways about it. Quit having ideas and listen for a moment. Please. You know, us, the human race, creating all of it, please. Creating all of these scenarios. The human race, quite possibly, have the solutions, but only if we can collaborate and cooperate and listen to one another.
I think
we have 2 ears, we have 2 eyes, we have 2 nostrils, we only have 1 mouth. Maybe we need to listen more, look more, and remember more.
I think you're right. Yeah.
Okay, we have another question here. Thank you. Thank you, Willow.
Hi, Ian. Ian, question to Ian, please. Two things. Very quickly, I read about these lamps going with street lamps. Do I need to be concerned about these LED street lamps?
Yeah, they are dangerous for several different reasons. One is the particular wavelength they use, which is more blue light, and they're usually coming on at night when you want to sleep. And our system can confuse the radiation of those frequencies with daylight. They're not that far away, and so you don't create the melatonin that we use for healing overnight. So that's one problem. You can, I've certainly seen in Wolverhampton, some people have asked for a shield to be put. It's not 100% solution. But that definitely is one of the things. They're also, my understanding is they don't have, what's the word, not filters, like domestic ones have a, phosphorus, I can't remember what the word is now, sorry, it's gone out. Diffuser, that's the word, thank you very much, whoever said that. Yeah, a diffuser on them, and the street lights often don't. They are very bright. And if you look on the top, some of them actually do have an aerial on top. Not all of them. Some of them, it's just a timer. And once we get the smart city in, they will dim as you walk past them at night, and then come up again. Or they'll dim as you've gone past, and they'll brighten up as you walk underneath it. Because you probably notice they don't spread out like the old street lights used to. They're much more focused down. And I've been asked quite a few times whether they can damage plants as well. And I've certainly seen where it looks very much as if it's done by the LED and not by a mast nearby, because we can't see a mast nearby. So that's another possibility. So yeah, worry about them. Yeah. Mark Steele, and some of you won't like Mark, I do actually speak with him from time to time, and he did a lot of work on LEDs up in there, so it's worthwhile looking at his website as well, if you can get hold of that, yeah.
We've got one last question here.
This is a question for Ralph. You may be very knowledgeable. You may be very knowledgeable about civil aircraft and the aircraft industry, who have the capacity to have tanks to spew out chemtrails, as we call them. What about the light aircraft that we see regularly, festooning the skies with trails that don't disappear, like vapor trails?
Sorry, and say that again. They have what?
We see regularly small aircraft going above us over all our towns, absolutely obliterating the sky sometimes with trails that don't disappear, chemtrails. Those are light aircraft.
No, these are ice trails. The thing is...
No, they don't disappear. Water vapor
Bear me
disappears.
out. Bear me out. One of the reasons we see more contrails now is because commercial aircraft are now flying much higher, and so there's a greater probability that the contrail will actually turn to ice, and therefore it won't dissipate.
Well, these aren't commercial aircraft.
Yeah, I know, but they go higher now. The old 737, you'd be lucky to get above 32,000 foot because it ran out of power.
These are small aircraft, actually.
The modern 737 will go up to 41,000 feet.
I'm sure.
And so the contrail will actually last a lot longer because the water actually crystallizes, it freezes.
Okay, well, these light aircraft are not going anywhere in particular. They're just
Light aircraft don't produce contrails.
They're going up and down, creating crisscross.
Yeah, the crisscross is caused by
Why
winds
are they not
above.
going anywhere in particular?
The crisscross, if you just listen, the crisscross pattern is caused by the wind blowing the contrail. So you have one contrail, the wind blows it, the next aircraft comes along, the wind blows it, the next aircraft comes along, and you end up with a whole series of parallel lines.
This is the same aircraft going up and down.
That doesn't happen.
Yes, it does happen. It does happen. I don't know many people...
The only aircraft that would do that is an RAF refueling aircraft, but, you know, they've only got about, I don't know, eight or nine of them.
Well,
they literally don't have an air force anymore.
They absolutely obliterate the sky with
I'll sit and watch them with you at some point, and I'll explain exactly what's happening.
I hope you do, because they're seen on a regular basis. Okay. It's not.
Thank you everyone for all the questions, and thank you to the panel. Thank you to Sandy. Thank you to all the security guards who come to support us, and thank you to all the council and the council members who come and listened and participated and shared.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks for everyone for coming and really staying to the bitter end. I mean, it's been a long time, and thank you for your concentration. I couldn't help but notice we've got Mr. Andrew Bridgen in the and just wanted to say thank you for coming, and if you want to say a few words, do.
I must admit, I thought I got away with that one. I think somebody asked a question about Christine Anderson, one of the early questions. Well, I have a confession to make. I was drinking beer with her till 1:30 on Wednesday morning in the beer factory on Place de Luxembourg, and I did get a standing ovation in the European Parliament, which wasn't on my bucket list. We are in very dangerous times. Democracy is under threat as it's never been before. It's not external forces that are doing this, really. It's the corruption and decay of our own institutions, and it's all around the world at the same time. There's a lot of suspicion out there, and it's going to take a lot to rebuild trust, which is quite rightly. And I'm worried it's going to have to get worse before it gets better, but a lot of people are waking up now, and what I'll leave you with tonight is that no is a very small word, but if enough people say it, it's a very big meaning. Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for coming. Please pick up any litter, any leaflets. We've got to clear out the hall quickly, otherwise the council will be on our backs again. Thank you everyone. Good night.